The next topic that I wanted to bring to your attention is at the 2019 Oregon Public Transit Conference, we had a recipient who was awarded the Oregon Transit Association Distinguished Service Award. Mr. Hal Gard was awarded this distinction, and it honors a public transportation decision maker, elected or public official, or private citizen who has contributed to the public transportation industry on the local level through policy, legislative initiative, and leadership. Alan Pollack, General Manager for the Salem Area Mass Transit District and the current OTA Chair, noted, Hal's consistent leadership has set ODOT Rail and Public Transit Division as a true partner to the public transportation service providers. This is a timely award as Hal is will officially retire at the end of the month, but will be staying on until February as we fill his position. So congratulations to Mr. Gard. So members of the commission, some of you have heard a little bit about this news, but I wonder if I could ask Bonnie to come forward for a second. So a longtime ODOT friend, Bonnie Heitch, is retiring from the Oregon Department of Justice after serving ODOT and the state for several decades. While most of you know Bonnie in her role as our general counsel, you may not know that Bonnie was a department employee many years ago. She was a land use specialist, transportation planner, and part of the Access Management Program. In 1999, she joined the Oregon Department of Justice General Counsel Division, and we were fortunate enough that she still liked us enough to have a passion for ODOT work. She has been our lead general counsel for nearly 8 years, and in that time, she's kept us out of trouble more times than any of us know, and gotten us out of the trouble we still were able to find ourselves in when we were already in the thick of it. Bonnie's worked on many projects over her years at ODOT, but the longest and most complicated was the I-5 Siskiyou Welcome Center that the commission was able to visit in August. Please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Bonnie, but it was the longest single project she has worked on in her entire career. She started working on it as an ODOT employee, and it landed in her lap again when she came to DOJ. She was pivotal to the success of that project, navigating the legal issues to a successful conclusion so that now the Welcome Center stands as a beautiful entry point for visitors to the state of Oregon. I'll pause here for a second and also say that I've been working with Bonnie for several years, off and on another project that probably feels like the longest project you've ever worked on. So I'm actually glad you have this one as well. Bonnie, I wanted to thank you for your many years of dedicated service to ODOT. I truly mean we will miss you. I don't want you to go anywhere. It's too soon, but I'm happy for you, and congratulations on your retirement.
Stay up here. I'm still in that.
Bonnie, on behalf of the commission, we want to add our thanks for all of your thoughtful advice and the ways in which you've helped us do our work. So congratulations on a great career, both apparently with us, with ODOT, and also at DOJ. So congratulations. Okay, public comments. Do we have? I have no list in front of me. Is there a public comment list? Is there anyone who would like to make a public comment? Oh, list may be at the back. Hang on. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Mr. Sworn. Welcome. Oh, can you please turn your mic on? Well.
Okay, the right side. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Is Mr. Strickland? Oh, there he is. Okay. The first issue I wanted to talk about some of the ones on the agenda, but the first issue is the issue of potential tolling in the Portland area. I believe that tolling existing routes would be contrary to federal policy. I know they make exceptions, but the gist of the policy was to encourage new routes to be built. And I also would be in favor of tolling some new highways. I believe some things that can be done very cost effectively and very helpful to transportation would be to develop a western route around Portland. In the Washington County 2017 study, they referred to this as the Northern Connector. It's not an interstate system highway. It's a route that can use existing roads and thoroughfares with addition of some more expensive things like a tunnel and a bridge across the Willamette. I think of it as 99 West. I think that would probably be an approximation. I know that's used by Barber Boulevard, but you think of a arterial highway, not really in the interstate category, but something that is functional and also a shortcut. And my motto is a shortcut benefits all modes. So one thing that's happened in the Portland area has been a lot of commuting traffic between Clark County and Washington County, and now there's kind of a lengthy route of I-5 and US 26, but this Northern Connector would reduce that route by 6 miles and connect to several MAX stations and then intercept 6 bus routes. So it's something very productive. And then I looked at East Side, because we've talked about an East Side crossing, so from Highway 14 on the Lady Island to I-84 is only 2.5 miles. So these are very short routes. We could increase the interstate capacity by about 75%, or about 65%. And I've looked at bridge designs. The network tied arch is very cost effective, and the river crossing distance is the same, so we could even do probably 2 bridges of the same design. And I think this would be an antidote to tolling other routes such as I-5 and I-84, because basically we've had a commuter problem that's been developing for 30 years. And that's it. The freight traffic, if there were no commuters as such that we have now, the freight would be just fine. Everybody else would be fine, but we haven't dealt with that commuter traffic. So a western route would do that. It would save horrendous tolling on I-5 and I-84 as some propose, and it would give us some beneficial routes and a lot of new business in Oregon too, helping to pay for it. So we've been talking about that. I've been going to some of the meetings in Oregon and trying to promote that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to make comment at this time? This is our time to hear from the public, so encourage you to come up if there's something you want to say. Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to our next item. And I think Brendan and Amanda are going to lead off the discussion on this. Want to come over here, Brendan?
Sure.
We've got you listed.
Yeah.
So, as you know, we approved the STS, the statewide transportation strategy for greenhouse gas reduction, and then the legislature took up the cap and trade bill, and so we've been, so we kind of took a break from what we were involved in a little bit to wait and to see what came out of the legislature, and now we're refocused and anxious to move forward on implementation. In fact, Chris and I will be at a meeting on Monday with 3 other agency and commission heads to start to talk about a coordinated effort on that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brendan, maybe to lead us off, and then Amanda, or
Yep.
whichever order you'd like to go. Thank you.
No, that's perfect, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Commissioners, Mr. Chair, Brendan Finn, Transportation Policy Advisor to Governor Brown. Thank you for teeing that up, Mr. Chair, and having me on the agenda to articulate some of the governor's direction that was articulated in this letter on September 23rd to 4 commissions and 4 directors. I will get into a little bit more, as Amanda will in her presentation, about what the STS is, what the roadmap is, and where we're going. I'm just here to let you know the importance that this has to the governor's climate agenda overall. The state of Oregon has had a long history and legacy of building livable communities through transportation and land use planning, going back to Governor Tom McCall. Some will recall the implementation of Senate Bill 101. But its importance is magnified today due to the effectiveness of these strategies in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to learn a little bit more about how that's going to be done through the STS. The governor would like to see the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Oregon Transportation Commission, as will be started in earnest, as the chair said on Monday, to take a leadership role with these other agencies and these other commissions in the implementation of the STS. So with that, I'll talk a little bit more about the details of what exactly that means here in a moment, but I'll turn it over to Amanda to go over some of the details.
So good morning. For the record, Amanda Peets, ODOT Program Implementation and Analysis Manager. You'll be getting a lot of me today, so I apologize in advance. So I'll talk about the statewide transportation strategy and what is that document. I really think of it as Oregon's carbon reduction roadmap for transportation. It was created back in 2013 based on legislative direction. The direction from the legislature was to look at ways to reduce transportation-related emissions by 75% below 1990 levels by the year 2050. So accordingly, we looked at all aspects of transportation, including the movement of people on the ground, the movement of people in the air, and the movement of freight on all transportation modes. It was a 3-year process that we used to develop the strategy using extensive stakeholder engagement and very rigorous technical analysis. The process overall won the AASHTO President's Award for Planning in 2013. So a little bit more about the engagement process. ODOT is often credited with developing the statewide strategy, but it was really a collaboration between the 4 state agencies shown here at the center of the circle. And when Brendan talked a little bit about the meeting on Monday, that's going to be between those 4 state agencies. So really continuing that tradition of developing the STS all the way through implementation. We also worked with our local jurisdiction partners, both from a technical perspective, so the people that are really on the ground, they understand what can work, what can't work. We worked with them in developing the strategy, those city and county partners. And then we also worked with those folks at the highest level, their elected officials. We worked with other agency commissioners, and we worked with interest groups ranging from the Oregon Environmental Council and Oregon Global Warming Commission to AAA and the Oregon Trucking Association. We developed a model actually for this work called Green Step at the time, and that was really to do the technical analysis, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Green Step won also several national awards. It's now been adopted into a suite of tools called Vision Eval. Those are used by many states today, and other local jurisdictions continue to adopt that tool. So a little bit of what we looked at as we were challenged with how do we reduce transportation-related emissions. We really looked at 5 different areas of actions that we could pursue, but we also considered what I would say is variables up there, or externalities. What is population growth? What are gas prices? What are people's incomes? That all affects how people travel and how much carbon they might emit. And then we looked at what opportunities we have as an agency or as transportation entities in the state to really move the lever. Things like vehicles and fuels, so cleaner fuels, like electric vehicles, some of those types of things. We looked at opportunities to price the system, our operations of our system, transportation options, and land use. I'll talk a little bit more about those. We tested over 200 scenarios. So as we started the effort, there were some people that believed, well, all we have to do is rely on technology. If we just get everything to convert to electric vehicles, then we'll get there. Or all we have to do is just densify our urban areas, we'll have some public transportation there, and we can get to the goal alone. What we found throughout the process is there is no one silver bullet. Any one of those alone gets us maybe halfway to the goal at the most, but we really need a combination of actions to go there. So we looked at different scenarios where we really varied the intensity of different actions to see really what can we do and what are the impacts of those. Not only on greenhouse gas reduction, which is the charge that we got from the legislature, but we also have to balance other important goals that Oregonians have and the impacts to them. So one of those things that we looked at is people's household budgets. So if we're pricing the system, what is the impact on the average Oregonian, especially low-income folks? So we looked at equity and tried to consider those things. So the mix of actions that we ultimately chose are those that maximize greenhouse gas reduction, but also try to minimize some of those adverse impacts as well. So we kind of looked at the performance overall. And then we selected a suite of actions. There's over 133 actions identified in the STS, so it's pretty broad sweeping in terms of what it calls for. I'm giving a few examples here, and I'll just walk through each so you get a sense of really what's in that document. One of the key aspects. Oh, go
Can I
ahead.
interrupt? Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
So could you describe for us what this grading system is, how it works?
Sure, excellent question. So what we looked at is with a certain combination of actions, what are the results of those? Do things perform, if we hadn't done anything, is it better than if we hadn't done anything? Is it about the same or is it worse? And so really that's what that's trying to show, is really compared to if we don't do anything, these changes, do they make it better for certain things, worse for certain things, or is it about the same? And that's really how we kind of weighted and evaluated this. This is just an illustrative example.
And the half moon, the half moon is
So
somewhat better, kind of better?
Correct. So the half moon would be somewhat better. The full circle would be quite a bit better. The circle with nothing in it is about the same, and then worse is moving in the wrong direction.
Thank you.
Sure. So as I mentioned, public transportation is a big way to help reduce emissions because you can move a large volume of people in a fairly carbon-efficient mode. To give a sense of the scale of what the vision would call for, by 2050, you're talking about a 3 to 6 time increase in most urban areas of public transportation services. So that's a pretty big increase. For electric vehicles, really trying to affect every mile driven, recognizing that that's the primary mode that people use today and are likely to use in the future. How do we affect every mile driven? So we need a large proportion of the fleet to be electric or to have a low carbon fuel. Land use is also important, the connection and intersect between land use and transportation, so the proximity that people have to travel where they need to get, and there's more transportation options within that. I think Oregon's benefited from our history of land use laws that has really managed growth well, and really the strategy calls for continuation of that good management of growth as well as increases in mixed-use development. And
I
then
have a
lastly,
question about that. Can you tell us how that's calculated? I'm not sure I understand how you do 15% times population growth for UGB expansions.
Great question. So actually that figure is basically over the last couple decades prior to developing the strategy. That's about the growth that we've experienced. So as populations increase, our urbanized areas are increasing, but not at the same rate that population increases. They increase slightly, kind of incrementally. So the 15% reflects kind of our historic trends on how we've managed growth, just continuing those into the future.
So is it 15% land or 15%? How does that calculate?
Sure, great question. So it's, if you look at population growth, let's say you're growing population by 1 million people, then the rate of your urban growth boundary would be about 15% of that 1,000 million people or whatever. So it's the population growth, it's a percentage of the population growth that is allowing for that accommodation. So as population increases, you're densifying those areas, but you also may not have the space to do that, so you're expanding slightly to accommodate that.
It's more of a technical question. I'll catch you later.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
I have a question. Going back to the electric vehicles issue, as population grows and as densification occurs, have you seen any indication that single-use vehicles, whether they're gas-powered or electric, are going to be less or more, or stay the same?
Okay, so if you're talking about the amount that people travel, is that part of the question?
Could be, yeah.
Okay, so we've seen the vehicle miles traveled in the state increase over the years, but if you look at it commensurate with population growth, it's actually staying the same or decreasing a little bit. So each individual person tends to be driving a little bit less than previously, not necessarily more, but we're getting more people into the state, so that has an impact on the amount that people drive.
On those population data points, were you able to look up what the ages were?
Right, so we have the type of analysis that we run is at really looking at household characteristics. So it looks at all demographic aspects of the population. So we use information from the Portland State University Population Research Center. And that includes demographic information, so information on people's age, gender, ethnicity, and so on. And we have good information from travel surveys and other things specific to Oregon that tells us how those people travel, how many cars they may own, and how they generally behave. So we kind of get down to that detail level, being able to look at the different characteristics of the households. Commissioner Calery, I'm not sure I answered your question. Would you mind clarifying?
Well, I think what I'm looking at is we have a push to get carbon-fueled vehicles off the highways. But we also have population growth, primarily in the urban areas of the state, but some rural. And we are definitely behind the capacity issue on our interstates and many other feeders. So I've heard people say, oh, people are not going to travel as much, or they're not going to be owners of single vehicles. They're going to use transit or whatever else. But I'm just wondering, that's not going to reduce, with the capacity issues we have, that's not going to reduce the use of the system. And that's my concern.
Okay, thank you.
And I think maybe that last one, Commissioner, the road pricing has the ability to deal with that demand issue that we have.
And I think in areas where we do see like high demands on the roadway system, we do see then higher use of public transportation, higher use of biking and walking opportunities as well. And then it's, to Brendan's point, really trying to price the system to has an impact on people's choice of modes. So I think even with these pretty aggressive assumptions, I think what it's interesting to point out is what the STS vision is able to accomplish versus what the statewide goal is. So we're able to achieve about a 60% reduction overall in greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. The statewide goal is a 75% reduction. If you look at it commensurate with population growth, we can get to about an 80% reduction. The state goal is ambivalent to whether you're supposed to look at population growth or not, so we just assumed total reduction, and that gets us to about a 60%. We have the biggest opportunity in particular to reduce emissions from the movement of people on the ground through our investments in modes like public transportation, biking, walking, our operational improvements, and pricing. Where it's a little more challenging to reduce emissions is in the freight transportation sector. Part of that has to do with the type of goods that are moved on our system, and therefore the mode that they best fit on for freight, as well as the consumption behavior of Oregonians. So the strategy was finished in 2013.
I have a question.
Please.
Sorry. I'm looking at the air passenger reductions, and I'm wondering what is moving the needle for that?
Great question. So there's a couple of different opportunities within the air passenger movement to reduce emissions. Some of those are technological improvements, especially for some of the ground vehicles that service the planes themselves. There's a number of federal initiatives that also have supported cleaner fuels and technology there. And then we also looked at opportunities for within the state of Oregon on high commuting corridors, such as like Eugene to Portland, where often people will fly that route. What other opportunities, such as passenger rail within that corridor, might serve to help some choose that opportunity and therefore reduce the air emissions. As we think about implementation and moving forward, I think it's important to recognize what we as transportation agencies and others in the state have ability to influence. Certainly the Department of Transportation is one entity that can help to implement the strategy, but there are also other state agencies. So as we think about clean fuels and things like that, that's the Department of Environmental Quality, so there's other state agencies engaged as well. Our city and county partners are often the ones that are putting in the larger networks of bicycle pedestrian enhancements, public transportation, some of those things. And then pricing, like we've talked about, whether that's a cap and trade system or even expanded road usage charge, really falls to the legislature to make some decisions. There are other things that I talked to you about before that are kind of externalities that also affect our ability to reduce emissions. People's income, the cost of fuel, things like that, but there are also market forces. What are people's willingness to buy electric vehicles? What's the perception on that? What are the type of conditions in the state? We have very different travel patterns in the Portland metropolitan area than we have in rural Oregon that are driving longer distances, may need a pickup truck for that. So we just have to recognize those other market forces are at play as we think about moving forward towards implementation. About a year following the completion of the strategy, we developed an implementation plan that's really for ODOT to say, what are those things that we're going to pursue to implement the strategy? There are 7 actions that we identified here. These are really things that are core to the mission of the Department of Transportation. And what we did is help to reprioritize some things. So Intelligent Transportation Systems, or ITS, is listed up there. So we reprioritized some of that work to make it come sooner so we could really test it, see what opportunities there are to rely on that as ways to help reduce emissions. In 2018, so last year, we did a monitoring report and said, okay, how are we doing in implementing those things? Not only the actions that we identified, but as a whole, are we moving in the right direction towards the strategy? What we did is highlighted some of the pieces, and I'm going to talk about a couple here as examples of some of the work that the Department of Transportation has engaged in. One is around electric vehicles and fuels. That's one of the 7 actions we identified in short-term implementation. So we've worked with the West Coast Electric Highways to put in charging infrastructure up and down the Interstate 5 corridor. We've also supported some investments with the help of the Transportation Commission in some alternative fuels like fueling stations in the Rogue Valley area. Another one that I think is also important to highlight because it does affect every mile driven in the state is our operational improvements. So in areas, Commissioner Calorie, like you talked about, that are congested and at capacity, how do we work to address emissions within those locations? And some of our real-time or intelligent transportation system mechanisms help to do that. So if you think about Highway 217, where we have variable speed limits, we have traveler information, and what that's really trying to do is help to keep traffic moving. Even if it's moving slowly, you're still helping to reduce emissions rather than being stopped and idling. You can see some exponential reductions even if you're moving 5-10 miles an hour. Another one that I'll highlight, and Mr. Finn will probably talk about a little later because it's called out specifically in the governor's letter to think about implementation actions, is scenario planning. Scenario planning is really the effort I talked about earlier, where you're testing very different options, how hard you push certain levers, and what those results are. So not only ODOT has engaged in that as part of the statewide strategy, there's some local jurisdictions that have as well. Portland Metro completed their climate smart work, and ODOT provided the financial support and many of the technical support for that effort. So we've actually worked with 5 MPOs across the state to do scenario planning to date. Those include Portland Metro, as I mentioned, and Central Lane. Both of those entities have gone through the full process where they've completed and adopted a statewide scenario plan. The other 3 MPOs, which are Corvallis, the Albany area MPO, and the Rogue Valley MPO, have done what we call a strategic assessment. So that's more a look at what are the types of things that they might need to do in order to achieve their greenhouse gas reduction target. It's not a commitment on their behalf, but it's them kind of helping to understand what options they need to pursue. I think as we have worked with the MPOs on these efforts, a couple things have become clear. One, each of those efforts have really validated what we have in the statewide strategy, that those are the right types of actions to reduce emissions, and those kind of repeat within each of the metropolitan areas that we've seen. And I think one of the big challenges that we've also noted in that effort is it's really challenging for the metropolitan areas to achieve their target within the financial resources they have today. So we know the types of actions needed, we need the money to implement those is a key. In terms of the cost of some of these efforts, full-scale scenario planning like Portland Metro did in Central Lane is in the millions of dollars range. Some of the strategic assessments we've done is about $40,000 to $50,000. I mention that because that is also another thing is the Department of Transportation was challenged by the governor with helping to find financial support for the scenario planning efforts. So just giving you kind of a sense of scale as we've done those. We also, in addition to looking at the 7 actions and our progress there and describing those in our monitoring report, we also looked at our overall progress in the statewide transportation strategy. So actions not only that Department of Transportation undertook, but other state agencies and our local partners. So I'll give a better walkthrough, Chairman Brocklin, on the chart here to just give you a sense of the indicators. So we found that some things are right on track with the strategy vision. So like the battery range, basically the amount of miles that you can get on our current electric vehicles in the short term is right on track with where we said it needs to be in the strategy vision. Then there's other things that are making progress, but still aren't to where that benchmark is on the strategy vision, such as vehicle mix. So we have a lot of trucks, sport utility vehicles and stuff on our roadways, for example. There's others that in the long term will make little progress based on where we are today unless there's some policy changes and other things that affect that. And then there's some things that are actually moving in the wrong direction. So they were better off when the strategy was developed, and they're actually moving in the opposite direction that they need to move. Please.
Do you have any idea why they're moving in the wrong direction?
Sure. So let me talk about a couple examples right here. So there's a couple things that are not moving in the direction that we had anticipated them to go. One is more, I would say, an externality, and gas prices. So when the strategy was developed back in 2012, gas prices were at a near all-time high, around $5 a gallon. We actually anticipated in the strategy that they would continue to rise. That has an overall impact on how much people drive, and in fact, they've decreased. So that's had a big effect on our ability to achieve the vision. Another one is the age of vehicles in our fleet. So when the strategy was developed, on average, vehicles were about 10 years old. People held on to them for about a decade. Now people are holding on to them even longer, upwards of like 13 years for holding on to a vehicle. So why does that matter? Newer vehicles have a higher miles per gallon. So actually the mix of our vehicles on our roadways, kind of going back to the ones that's shown on red, the mix of vehicles in our roadways is fairly dirty compared to where we wanted it to be. So this graphic illustrates where our strategy vision is, which is the darker line here on the bottom, versus where we are. We actually had an uptick in emissions. So if we hadn't done some of the things, this would be worse. But because of some of the factors I mentioned in this previous slide, we've seen a little bit of an uptick in emissions. However, longer term, based on investments within public transportation and others, that we anticipate to reduce emissions. However, there's still a gap that exists there. So what we found in our 2018 monitoring work is there's a mix of actions that we can still pursue that I talked about earlier to help close that gap. That's achievable. Those are things that we can do. And it's still validated that the strategy is that right roadmap for pursuing things moving forward. You can see a big chunk of that is vehicles and fuels, but it's not the only one. Again, there's no silver bullet. We have a number of things that we have to do to get there. As we think about, Commissioner Simpson, do you have a question?
Quick, when you're saying vehicles, you're talking about all fossil fuel engines, trucks, cars, buses, or are you just talking about like single occupancy vehicles?
All vehicles, that is correct. So particularly in this graphic, I'm not talking about freight transportation, I'm talking about the movement of people on the ground, which is this distribution right here. But it is all vehicles, sport utility vehicles, trucks, whatever, no matter if you're carpooling or driving alone. As you think about the actions to pursue to help close that gap, I think it's important to distinguish between what are investments, which are shown here and highlighted as I animate this, versus the other remaining piece are the policies that you need to put in place and some of those market forces that I described earlier. And as you think about different investments, these are just some examples here of if a pricing mechanism is set, say, for value pricing within the Portland metropolitan area, there's enabling things that we can invest in to support that tolling. There's other investments within public transportation, biking and walking, and so on, that we can make to help move the needle. So that's kind of showing that proportion. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Finn to talk about some of the governor's specific direction.
Great, thank you, Amanda. To put a finer point on the EV portion, Commissioner Cowler in particular, there's been some great work done by Amanda and Daniel Porter, kind of looking at the scenarios of what will we get, what is the trajectory of EV adoption, and how is that going to play out as far as our greenhouse gas reduction goals? And we had to, after we got that data back, it was like a pill we had to swallow, because we tend to think that electric vehicles are a panacea to our reduction, especially amongst passenger vehicles, not heavy freight, because we know that's a ways off. That even with the most ambitious adoption rates, we're not going to get there through passenger vehicle electrification. While it's still one of our biggest strategies for greenhouse gas emission reductions, there's also many other strategies that we have to have in place, as you saw here.
Well, and maybe if I can add on to that. So I think that has a lot to do with the turnover of vehicles. So we're holding on to our vehicles longer. So we're replacing about 15% of our fleet each year. And of that percentage that we replace, only about 5% of those are new vehicles. So even if all new vehicles are electric, you're only replacing at a rate of about 5% per year. So it is that slow turnover.
Is that more focused on urbanized areas rather than rural? Or, because where I'm from, I see the same people driving the same vehicle for 20 years. And when the economy is not good, you're not going to see that. You're not going to see people buying new vehicles, whether they're EV or not. So,
Right, and those are statewide averages.
oh, okay.
Yeah, I think what we found through, the kind of the analysis that's been done is that it's two things that drive adoption. It's cost and it's infrastructure. So I know that the governor would like to see us go a little bit further in both of those regards, so probably more to come for your consideration in that regard. But you're right, Commissioner, it's really a question of infrastructure and cost. So it takes a village of agencies to get the STS done. While the governor wants all the enterprise of state government to be involved in climate change, these are the climate change agencies. And as far as the implementation of the STS, ODOT should take a leadership role in the governor's eyes. And so in this letter, we did provide some specificity of some kind of guiding thoughts on some things that the governor would like to see moving forward, and that's some greenhouse gas emissions performance measures, some metropolitan, we talked a little bit about the scenario planning that's been done in the metro areas and in some other MPOs, but supporting that work, as well as just having it at the highest level of the agency, and also have it something that the commission addresses regularly as far as its progress is concerned. Your colleagues in the Land Conservation Development Commission will be addressing this issue, I guess, later this afternoon. And I know you'll be meeting with them on Monday. So I would also like to impress the sense of urgency that we have here. While this effort was delayed a bit based on the potential for legislation in the last legislative session, the governor would like to convey that it's time. So appreciate your efforts and obviously those of the agency that they've done to kind of tee up this work for you. So we're happy to answer any questions at this point.
Let me just respond briefly to those comments, Brendan. So just speaking for myself, I welcome the opportunity to lead on this, and I agree with the governor. The time is now, and I think it's an issue that has been somewhat delayed here because of other priorities, and we need to step up the pace. There are a lot of questions to be answered in all this, and I think the interagency discussion, I'm looking forward to that on Monday. That will be the commission chairs and the directors of the departments, is a really important conversation that Monday's the beginning of what I hope is a long and fruitful ongoing focus on this issue. I would say that greenhouse gas emissions is a worldwide issue, and we won't address all of the challenges facing the world on greenhouse gas, but I compliment the governor on her leadership on this, and we can only do what we can do in Oregon to be a participant in both in making a contribution to the broader efforts that are hopefully going to occur with respect to global and national efforts, but also, because we're in a situation where we're a growing state, and this is an issue in our own airsheds, and we do have a responsibility to manage our airsheds as actively and positively as we can. This raises not only interdepartmental issues, but a lot of intergovernmental issues, I think, with respect to how we are working with the national government, and how we're working with our regional government and our cities, counties, and others, not just on land use, not just on transportation, but on land use and energy conservation, a whole range of things. And I think we need to model effective collaboration in this. So it's a lot of detail under that, a lot of work to be done. I do think we need to set active goals and timelines for action, because action is, we have had a plan, we need to continue to talk about it, but we need to move forward with actions that actually move the needle here further, much further than we have to date. So that's my individual view. Others on the commission may have slightly or somewhat different views, but I'm personally excited about engaging in this because I think it's a very important piece of our priority list, our portfolio of responsibilities. So others may want to respond to that, and then what I'd like to do is we ordinarily don't take public comment along the way we do the public comment at the beginning, but we do have some people who want to offer public comment, so I'd like to allow them to offer public comment before we take questions, go into a question and answer period with the two of you. So if there are other comments on what I've just said or what Brendan's just said, this might be a good time to say something.
I have some comments, but I'm happy to wait till we hear from the community.
Okay, that's great. So I think at this point, we have 3 people who have requested an opportunity. And again, as I said, we don't normally do this. We try and do public comments at the beginning, but this is an important issue, and I think we want to hear from people who want to say something about it. So what I'd like to do is have these 3 people I'm about to name who have requested to comment on this subject take these 3 seats in front of these 3 microphones here, and that allows 2 of you to stay here. So I have Sarah Wright, Bob Courtwright, and Ron Swerin on this issue. We will continue to apply our 3-minute limit on comments per person. And so who wants to lead off?
I'll go.
Okay, Sarah, welcome. Nice to see you again.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Wright with the Oregon Environmental Council, which is a nonprofit environmental advocacy group statewide. And first, I want to thank you for the time, and I also want to appreciate that you're moving forward on the statewide transportation strategy. This is an urgent need, as you know, and as you just saw, we're falling further and further behind on our emissions reductions goals every day. And I think, as Chair Van Brackelen just said, that the time is now to act. So we're urging you to move forward with the urgency that matches that need, and I'm really glad to see that you're moving forward on the multi-agency coordination, and that collaboration I think will be really productive and has a lot of exciting opportunities. Along with this collaborative action, however, there are a lot of ways that ODOT as an agency can move forward with its own activities, and OEC urges you to move forward on those as soon as possible. And as you heard earlier, we need to be doing all the things, which is a lot, and it's hard, and it's going to require a lot of work. We strongly recommend that ODOT immediately begin to bring forward greenhouse gas emissions reduction in its core work. in implementing policy, you're going to see presentations today about implementation of policy. The question for all of that implementation needs to be, how is this going to meet our greenhouse gas reductions goals? How is it going to bring us further forward? Just as an example of something coming up soon, the I-5 trunnion replacement is an opportunity to do aggressive improvement and promotion of transportation options. There are a lot of opportunities. And this work is going to need strong leadership, so we are asking you or urging you to appoint a strong leadership to lead this internally right away. So we also are asking that you move forward immediately on one of the actions in the governor's letter that's called out specifically as an ODOT action, which is to identify and act on options for financial and technical assistance to MPOs to develop and implement their own greenhouse gas emission reduction plans. ODOT has deep technical experience and strong relationships with the MPOs, and this is a tremendous opportunity to move forward in a way that benefits the whole state. So the need is urgent, and we hope to see ODOT reflect that urgency in its actions. And thank you for your time, and thank you for your work. This is really important.
Thank you, Sarah. Bob, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Bob Courtwright from Salem. I've appeared before you before, and I have a slightly revised letter from what I submitted last month. I want to agree with the comments that you just received from Sarah. I want to ask you, as you think about this issue, to think about the things that the Commission can do immediately in the next 3 months. Certainly, a longer-term, broader discussion among the agencies is necessary. There's lots in the STS that needs to be spelled out, but we need to make progress to turn around where we are in metropolitan areas. I wanted to give you 3 quick thoughts about the statewide transportation strategy. First, maybe to correct the chair, there is a long history of the agencies working together on this issue. In 2010, Gail Achterman, your chair, and the chair of the Land Conservation and Development Commission chaired a legislatively convened task force, the MPO Greenhouse Gas Task Force, that recommended that metropolitan areas by now routinely plan for emission reductions as they do planning. The STS was one of the things that came out of that task force, that the state should identify the things it can do and the things it can do to help metropolitan areas to do this. So you're building on what you started with there. Second, and Amanda touched on this, but I think it's really important to think about the scale of change that we're talking about here. And I think Commissioner Callaway talked about this as well. To achieve emission reductions, we have to substantially expand transportation options. The one that jumps out is a 3 to 6 time increase in the amount of public transit in our metropolitan areas. That's a huge change. And it's a huge change that's an organizational challenge for ODOT and for local governments in delivering those kinds of solutions. So we need to keep that in mind. The third point I wanted to make is, again, we need to do everything, but it's important to keep in mind the synergy among the strategies. It isn't just doing these things independently. Transit, bike and pedestrian improvements, transportation option incentives work best and may work only where we have people who live in walkable, compact, mixed-use neighborhoods. So that land use linkage is critical to making transportation options work. And again, when you think of the scale of change we're talking about, and the STS says we need to reduce vehicle travel by about 20% per person on average over the next 30 years, that's a huge change and is a major kind of institutional challenge. So I'd get back to, I think, the points that OEC just talked on and are mentioned in the governor's letter. I think you need to have the director appoint a manager to lead this effort with the kind of organizational change you face, and we need to get financial resources to build the partnership and capability of metropolitan areas to do this work.
Thank you, Bob. Mr. Sworn?
Ron Sworn, Portland, Oregon. I forgot to state my name for the record on the previous comment. I've worked in construction, and I did some research, and concrete production accounts for 8% of greenhouse gases. And as we see people moving here, there's a lot of concrete being used, especially in urban environments, a lot of concrete high rises. And the other thing is, people are tending to work in service economy in big buildings. So just try to imagine what a building this size is using for energy. That's a lot. If it's gas, it's a lot of fossil fuel being burned. You think of all the office buildings that are heated or air conditioned 24/7, so that's a lot of energy use. So that's something that's not really talked about too much. It's not just transportation. I read a website called Green Car Congress, and it's kind of motorheads that are environmentally friendly. And there are so many really breathtaking developments that are going on that will reduce emissions that can be done through the market. I don't know if it's really necessary to have a big state program addressing these issues. People are going to be taking a lot of those things into consideration when they make purchases. I believe that's true. I see more electric vehicles on the road now. And hydrogen is another alternative. Japan is making big investments in hydrogen. So when you see what's happening in the world as far as innovation and then what could become available in the U.S. market, I think there will be a lot of changes without government action per se. So that's the question is, are we making something that's going to have a life of its own and will cause, sometimes maybe be counterproductive or not accomplish what it should be accomplishing, but it takes a lot of time. I have a kind of a theory, maybe someone would disagree, but when a government raises fees and taxes to correct various environmental problems, it also causes a need for more economic activity. So you have kind of a resurgence of the activity that they're trying to correct in the first place. And then some of these things can really take on a life of its own. I've been watching what's happening up in Washington, where they're trying to raise lots of money, but they do it in a way that causes such a public reaction. Now this I-976, I think it is. Anyway, very, very big controversy. And so part of it was spurred by a $50 billion bond measure. I know the voters approved it, but was something that huge really needed. So I think environmental change is coming through consumers and demand and what the producers are making. I just don't know how much that should be regulated and shepherded by the government or by the state government. Thanks.
Thank all three of you for your comments. Appreciate it, and look forward to further discussion. Okay, now I think we should move to questions off the presentation directed to Amanda and Brendan. So who is?
I'll go.
Okay. Vice Chair Simpson.
Okay. Quick
I'm
one.
not gonna forget any of you.
On the, there was a slide that you have, obviously in the packet, the multi-agency implementation, and under the, let's see, second sub-bullet point of the second bullet point, there's the metropolitan scenario planning. I'm just curious as to, are you familiar with what specifically that scenario planning entails? Is it bike lane assessments? Is it compact mixed-use development in areas that don't have them? Is it alternative fueling stations? I mean, I'm just curious as to what does that scenario planning really entail, and is the department involved in any of that by any shape or form?
Great question, Commissioner Simpson. So yes, we're very familiar. We helped set up the processes with Portland Metro. We ran all the technical support for Center Lane area as they did their scenario planning, and then each of the strategic assessments that I mentioned earlier were the ones that do the technical work for them, and we provide support to kind of run them through the process. So what that process looks like is very similar to what I described for the statewide transportation strategy. They basically look at those 5 areas: vehicles and fuels, systems operations, transportation options, some of those kinds of things, even pricing mechanisms within their authority, right? So they could look at, on the more localized side, parking pricing, public transportation investments, biking and walking, alternative fueling stations, some of those kinds of things. They also look at then how might their efforts complement statewide efforts. And so I think that's also another kind of important point as we talk about implementation of the strategy here, is that kind of complement between the state and the local actions. In terms of kind of level of effort and what does it take, to do scenario planning all the way through adopting a preferred scenario is a full-blown planning process that takes about a year to 2 years to do. And as I said, around $1 million or more to kind of run through that process. And really, a lot of that entails working with the stakeholders. So there's that technical piece where you're really kind of pulling the levers and seeing what the impacts are. And then it's really the vetting of the palpability of that within your local jurisdiction. So what are the trade-offs that you're making as you're doing that? How does that complement your existing efforts? And really, what type of funding do you have to support those things? So it's kind of establishing a longer-term vision like we're talking about here with the statewide transportation strategy. We do have fairly limited staff right now to support that work. So we have one person that's a transportation modeler that runs the Vision Eval tool that I mentioned earlier. That's that evolution of Green Step. And then we usually provide some planning time staff support to help the jurisdiction work through that process, kind of negotiate, figure out what that outreach looks like, and kind of work through those technical aspects. If all areas were to be able to do that, we don't today have that existing capacity built in. That would be something we'd have to consider as we move forward.
Great, and then one last follow-up to that, because I think Mr. Courtwright made a really good point as he had indicated the significance and importance of compact development. And as the beginning of your presentation, you're talking about, you know, the UGB and that growth impact of how it relates to populations. If we are going to be engaged with all these agencies and we are working with metropolitan regions around scenario planning, I would highly encourage the agency to look at it from a triple bottom line perspective. It cannot just be an environmental lens. It has to think about the economic impacts and the social impacts, because right now, and I'm only using Portland as a reference because this is where I live, and obviously this is where a lot of this focus is, because that's the biggest metropolitan region is in the entire state. But the point I'm making here is that I would assume that our predecessors who were planning around the compact developments that are taking place in the urban core right now in the city of Portland thought about it through an environmental lens, right? However, it created a lot of negative impacts as a result, not from the social, but economic. And so when we look at other areas around metropolitan regions that maybe would be considered blighted, that are being considered for future developments through comprehensive plans and whatnot, we want to look at it from a perspective that people do not have to leave their communities to have to put food on their table and put money in their pockets. So that when we think about scenario planning, we think about it not only from an environmental lens, but how we can utilize these transit systems more logically and more comprehensively in a district, in more compact developments that actually support a triple bottom line outcome for those communities.
Yeah, excellent point, Commissioner Simpson. I think that highlights the importance, again, of not just looking at greenhouse gas reduction, but looking at all those other goals that you're trying to achieve and really finding that right balance. And I think one thing begets another, too, in your conversation of basically housing affordability as you're densifying some of these areas and people wind up moving to cheaper areas, that does also affect the overall travel. So there is a relationship there, and I think that's important to note. Thank you.
So Commissioner Smith and then Commissioner Brown.
So I have the privilege of representing 2/3 of the area of the state of Oregon, central and eastern Oregon. And I know a lot of the data you have is aggregated throughout the state. So the low-hanging fruit obviously is in the metro areas, in the large cities. And it seems to me that we need to, it'd be nice if we could tease out what it looks like in the rural areas. And I don't know if there's a way to do that, because I think we have a very different, I think that the impacts are different and how you move that needle is different. It's not gonna have the bang for the buck that you're gonna get in a metro area. But I think there are things that can be done in rural areas, and first and foremost foremost is I think we have a different strategy, because I don't think the same thing is going to work. And it's important, I think one of the first steps is educating folks on the greenhouse gas reduction and why it's important. And I think we need to do that in a way that respects the rural nature of the community. You know, on the east side of the Cascades, there's one MPO, I think. So MPO planning isn't the way to do it on the east side necessarily. And we have to include all of our community, not just the metro area, because we have a lot of voters and they are represented. So if we don't have the same level of understanding and acceptance, we're not going to make the strides that we need. So I don't know if there's a way to tease some of that out to help us and who represent rural folks to make the change that needs to happen.
So excellent point, thank you for raising that. As we did the analysis for the statewide transportation strategy, we actually separated out our metropolitan areas from our more rural areas, and we even looked at each metropolitan area separately because even they are distinct. Rogue Valley is very different from Portland metropolitan area. So we did look at kind of the strategies that might work most appropriately for them and kind of met with those jurisdictions as we talked through things. And I think there are very different things that you can look at. We probably focused more on the presentation on some of those urban aspects, but there are more rural aspects. I even think about the private sector, right? They're more for profit on the types of things that they do. And we're seeing installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Baker City and some of our eastern portions of the state too, because they're seeing a potential market segment there. So there's some opportunities for electric vehicle charging stations in some of our more rural areas. I know that doesn't work for all folks that live out there, but there's a number of other opportunities from even safe routes to school, investments in some of our smallest communities too. So I think that's a great point in terms of sussing out what might be those more urban strategies and some of those more rural strategies, because there are some in the STS that work for all.
And Commissioner, I think that's a great point just overall on climate legislation, how we deal with climate change and the rural and our rural communities. I know that the governor's taking a very deliberate approach to her efforts around climate and addressing how those regulations could impact rural environments. So there's also that kind of component, almost going back to what Commissioner Simpson was saying in rural environments. I think that's very recognized, at least at the governor's level, and that however we move forward, we have to be very cognizant of that, because we're not going to have the ability to have dense mixed-use environments that are served by transit in a lot of the territory that's east of the Cascades. So we do have to have a different approach, and the infrastructure that Amanda mentioned around electric vehicles, another thing in the adoption of new vehicles that are used to fuel the rural economies are not online yet. So those are the kind of things that we have to look at in addressing how are we going to increase that adoption rate for things like electrification of the transportation system. But it definitely has to be deliberate, and I think at least just making that, stressing that point that the governor feels that climate legislation needs to not hurt the economies of rural Oregon.
Commissioner Brown?
So 23 years ago, I started with the Rogue Valley Transportation District in transportation demand management planning in our community, and the frustration that I felt over the 23 years, I can't even express. We're not moving the needle. And although I appreciate Mr. Swanson's testimony on government shouldn't get involved, we can't keep repeating the things we're doing over and over unless we have direction and policy from our government to move it. The good news is across the state of Oregon, transportation options is growing, even in Eastern Oregon and in Central Oregon, where they are trying to work with some of your largest trip generators to reduce the amount of vehicles that are commuters to their employment agencies. And with the additional STIF dollars for transit, they're now starting to be able to look at commuter routes and doing different things, even in Eastern Oregon. So that's the good news. The frustration, I think, goes back to the economic piece that Commissioner Simpson talked about was that our state has struggled for years and years. And as big employers come in, we look at it and embrace it, because at this point, we're actually doing economic development in our communities. The bad news is that as these come in, and I think yesterday, some of the information we received from Region 2, when they were talking about Amazon moving in. Amazon moves in, they increase the freight traffic on the system. But what didn't come with that was the reduction of their employees' travel, working with the transit agency to reduce that. And if there isn't regulation behind it to make them do it, and there's always the piece that says, well, if you regulate and you demand this, they won't come. I think that a lot of these larger employers are starting to understand that they have a responsibility, doesn't matter where, but in the nation. And so I think that there's ways of working with that. And the one piece that ODOT I'm proud of is that they are trying to move the needle as far as the transportation options, but it's not enough. We need to really look at being able to put dollars in that realm along with the transit to make all of those things work together. And so working with those other agencies, the environmental agency, land use, it's important. And I think that we need to have those conversations and keep pushing.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Callery?
As a follow-on to Commissioner Smith and Commissioner Simpson, when you talk about densification in urban areas, that's being offset in many ways, and I'm going to use the Oregon coast as the primary example. People who have a home somewhere else always look for, I shouldn't say always, but many times look for a place that they can have their dream home on the Oregon coast, and that's not helping densification, and it doesn't help travel either. So I'm hoping that as you move forward, that you will look at that as an issue that needs a strategy to solve it. I don't know that there is one, because that's unfortunately, or fortunately for those that do it, that's their dream, is to have a place on the Oregon coast or sometimes in the mountain areas and that type of thing. But I look at the communities that I'm familiar with, and about the only place I'm seeing any densification is, for example, in Newport, where they've had to build some apartments because they have more students at the various institutions there around the bay. But in other parts of the state, I haven't seen, or other parts of the coast, I haven't seen any apartment complexes or anything else. It's all single-family homes, usually on a very large piece of property. So I think that has to be taken into consideration as you move forward with the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further questions for Amanda or Brendan at this time? Director Strickler?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, not a question, but really a comment. I think what I'm hearing in the questions is a desire for a little more data in the background. So we've got aggregate data that you've seen in the presentation today, but questions around EV split currently in the fleet by geography. I think I heard that, as well as the SOV VMT. How has that changed? Those kinds of characteristics, but then also the geographic relevance of what is the impact in the urban area versus the rural area, and are we sending a message inadvertently, mind you, that this is just an urban issue? And so I think that as we start to go forward, we'll tease out some additional data points that we have within the data, and to the extent that we can, and that we have the information, and then certainly I'd look at the team to see if there's other options to gather that data if we don't have it today.
Thank you. There's a lot here to unpack and think through, and we're not going to be doing that in the next 15 minutes, but we are going to be doing that going forward, starting on Monday. So I appreciate the public comments. I appreciate the presentation and comments by Brendan and Amanda and Director Strickler. and a lot of good initial questions coming out of the commission with a lot more work to be done and a lot more drilling down on an action plan. So thank you all very much, and appreciate the time you've spent on this today, and we'll upshift here. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move to the next agenda item. So I guess Amanda's just going to sit with us here all morning. But we're now going to move to another presentation, this one on specific transportation plans, including those on bike ped, safety, and transportation options.
Well, good morning. I feel like it's been forever since I've been up in front of you here. For the record, Amanda Peets, Program Implementation and Analysis Manager.
Stephanie Millar, Transportation Options Program Manager. Oops. Stephanie Millar, Transportation Options Program Manager.
And Steve Cooley, ODOT Chief Engineer.
Welcome welcome joining Amanda here in her day in court.
I appreciate the help. So we're going to talk to you today about plan implementation efforts, and I actually think it pairs nicely with the previous discussion on the statewide transportation strategy, because we talked a little bit there about some of our early implementation efforts and really kind of that stronger implementation need. And so I want to talk to you about kind of what we've done in our other statewide plans, and really we need that implementation focus there as well. So we have eight plans in total. The Oregon Transportation Plan is kind of that umbrella document, and then we have mode and topic plans like the Bicycle Pedestrian Plan and Transportation Options Plan that really help to refine the statewide transportation plan. All of these documents are adopted by the Transportation Commission, and they really serve as the guide for the state on transportation. They establish the goals for what you want to achieve, and the policies help to describe how we're going to achieve those goals. The plans really direct the work of the Oregon Department of Transportation, and they influence the work of local jurisdictions, whether that's our metropolitan planning organizations, cities, or counties. All the way from the work in planning to the types of investments that are made, all the way down to how we construct, maintain, and operate our system. Some of the policies provide fairly general direction that we need to actually refine and figure out how we operationalize in our day-to-day efforts. There's some other policies that call for very specific products to be developed. So accordingly, we put together an implementation work program that we really is focused on ODOT's efforts to implement the plan and integrate it into our day-to-day work. We identify who in the agency is responsible for the different actions, what those actions are, and kind of a time frame for when we will complete them. We have set together a formalized process for the development of these work programs, and there's a couple of reasons why we do this. One is to make sure that we're really considering how we implement our plans in all of the business that we do throughout our entire agency. We also want to create a strong commitment to those actions so that we put them on paper and say, these are what we're going to do, these are how we're going to be intentional about them. And then lastly, kind of that accountability mechanism, making sure that we're following through. What are those mechanisms in place to assure that we're making progress on what we want to make progress on? Once we finish that internal document, we bring it to the commission for review, and then go ahead and execute and report on that periodically. So I've provided in the past kind of written updates on the statewide plans in your quarterly reports. This is a first in-person update. So why in person now? I think we've reached some major milestones, and Mr. Cooley's going to highlight one of those, and Stephanie some others as well, that I think illustrate the cross-collaboration inside the agency and how we're really trying to integrate things. And I think they're also to help to illustrate how we do our work different as a result of the plans. That now that the plans have been adopted and you take action on those, we should be doing our work different to try to achieve those. One of the first implementation work programs we did was for the Bicycle Pedestrian Plan. Actually, I would say the statewide transportation strategy is probably the first model that we had, and something more formalized with a Bicycle Pedestrian Plan. These are now required. So in House Bill 2017, the Transportation Funding Package, there was a change to statute to say the commission needs to develop work programs and you guys need to approve those. So that will be triggered for the recently adopted Oregon Public Transportation Plan. And so staff is currently working through the work program for that and hope to bring it to you in the spring of this next year. So as Chair Van Brockland said, I'll be talking to you about 3 plans today, and I brought some help with me to talk about those. First of which is the bicycle pedestrian plan. So that implementation work effort was reviewed by the Commission in 2016, and really looks out over the next 5 years to say what are the things that we need to focus on and accomplish. A couple things that I want to illustrate in some of the highlights of what we've been working on are really how do the plans impact the work that we do in the agency. So one perspective is from how we're organized, our staff structure. So we recognized in the plan that we had a gap in some expertise and knowledge of what are the needs of those types of users and how do we really get those types of projects on the ground. So we created what we call active transportation liaison positions in each of the 5 regions. These are very similar to the regional transit coordinators too, that kind of focus on a subject area expertise and then work with our local partners to make sure we have a seamless transportation system that serves the needs for, in this case, of bicyclists and pedestrians. It also affects our guidance and our policy that we set forward. So Mr. Cooley here will talk about our design guidelines and how we've updated those to change the way that we put out our bicycle and pedestrian projects in the state. The plan also informs conversations at the highest level. So in House Bill 2017, as we were leading up to that, the agency was asked, what are some of the needs for bicyclists and pedestrians? And we really looked at the plan. We were able to pull numbers and figures from the plan to say, okay, here's the needs. And then we also had our priorities in the plan of, here's the types of connections we need. Connections to public transportation, connections to schools. And we were able to successfully basically mimic the plan ask for safe routes to school and what we got from the Oregon State Legislature. So I think that shows kind of that direct connection of plans. The other is once we do have an investment program, how do we integrate the policy direction in our plans? And in our multimodal active transportation fund, that's kind of the spinoff of the bicycle pedestrian money in the Connect Oregon fund. We have in our draft rule right now a policy in the statewide plan that talks about regional paths, and it has criteria to identify only those projects that really would raise up to the level of regional or statewide significance. So that helps us in our prioritizations and really what we put on the ground. The other things that our plans tend to include are key initiatives, and those are included in the adopted document and usually are limited in number and describe some of those things that are so foundational that we need to achieve in order to help move in the direction of the plan vision. For the bicycle pedestrian plan, there's 3, 2 of which are data and performance measures. We're just really starting the work on the data and performance measures here. There's a lot of information that we need to help support decisions that we make. So for example, for biking and walking, we have good information on crashes on the system, but not necessarily how much are people actually biking and walking. So what proportion of that is really based on how much people walk. So is it more unsafe for people walking because that crash rate is higher, for example? So that's the kind of work that will ferret out. The other and the bigger one that we've been working on and making a lot of progress is defining the network. And so we had existing data for biking and walking systems, but not down to the finite level that we need for understanding connectivity issues, for example. So the data that we had before, we couldn't tell if there was a gap within a block. And if there is a missing sidewalk for a block, then somebody with a disability or whomever can't get through, and that's a major obstacle. So what this did is go through and refine that data so that we know what our entire biking and walking system looks like, and also using the priorities from the plan, start to prioritize those things. And really what we're moving towards is the creation of a management system. We have one for bridge, we have one for pavement, we have not had one for bicycle and pedestrian. And really we've started to create that so that we're more efficient and effective with our investments. The other thing is updating our design guidelines, and that's what Steve's going to talk about here shortly. And between knowing what our system has on it today, so those existing conditions, that inventory, and what we think it should have in the future, so those design guidelines for what we should put there, that helps to set expectations for what our bicycle pedestrian network should look like in the future. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve to talk about the design piece.
All right. I'm here to discuss some of the very good work that the Urban Design Initiative team has been working on and getting ready to give you an overview of that and then the implementation of that work. But the Urban Design Initiative was a very collaborative effort between the planning group, the active transportation and technical services and engineering branch. The goal is to produce urban design guidance allowing flexibility using a performance-based approach, accounting for land use and the local context, and also accounting for all the modes of transportation. So this is a shift from the practice of more of a standard, a fixed standard approach, and which works better for new construction, but we're in an urban area that's already been developed and we're doing retrofits, so we needed something to give us that flexibility to allow for developed areas or redeveloping areas. So we've completed a urban design manual. It was the blueprint for urban design. That's the cover of it on the left there. And it updates all of ODOT's guidance on urban design. So it'll be the guidance for the whole agency. It updates the bicycle and pedestrian manuals, the highway design manual, traffic manual, and so on. So this will be the guide for the agency. It improves the flexibility and alignment in the urban guidance so that we're all using all the way from planning, all the way to scoping and project design. We'll all be using the same guidelines. And it has in there, I'll get into a little bit of some ranges instead of a fixed standard approach based on the context or the conditions. And it really emphasizes the use of the context when making those design decisions. And that gets into that performance-based approach. This is a practice that's happening nationally. It's a shift in the practice. I don't know if you remember in the 90s we had a context-sensitive design. That was the latest thing in doing our design and applying the context. Then in the early 2000s, we had a practical design practice, and now we're moving into the performance-based practice. All of our AASHTO main manuals, our geometric design standards, our AASHTO Green Book is going to be rewritten in this with this approach, the performance-based approach using context identified in the manual. I was just recently at the my AASHTO committee meeting 2 months ago in St. Louis, where Minnesota was revealing their manual that they've rewritten to allow for this performance-based approach. And the discussion around the table is it's occurring in other DOTs as well. So we are, in our guidelines, we have used all of that research that's going into those rewrites. So specifically to the bike and pedestrian manual. Some of the updates haven't been put in those manuals, but the research is what we used. So we have kind of the cutting edge research in our guidelines that we have developed here. One thing this does is it also improves the coordination and collaboration within our agency, from highway to planning, active transportation, federal highway. We have the one guidance document now, and it will give us the urban guidance all the way from the planning all the way through the process. So we'll be talking the same language, so there's not there is, at times can be a little disconnect between the planning and the project design side. So this will kind of tie that all together. I don't know if you could see the detail on there, but this is just a quick example of the first thing that a project team will do is go in and identify the context, and we have 6 contexts identified in our guidance, which aligns with the AASHTO method that's going to be updated. And it accounts for the land use, the development patterns, road connectivity, and then you select a target speed based on the area. Then the next overall process would be, now based on that context, what is the desired outcomes for your project? And then establish your design decisions based on outcomes and performance. So you evaluate the performance of your design decisions that you're making, and it's an iterative process. So this is not a cookbook where you select the context and therefore here's your range of travel lane widths or shoulder widths. You have to do the analysis and consider the safety and operations as we always would do. But it's driven by the context and then going in and what is the performance for that corridor. And then the financial feasibility kind of allows that practical piece of our approach in there to, we have limited funds, so based on the performance requirements, what can we do? What is the most cost-effective way to get the performance that we're looking for? So it helps in that. Then you go through that several times and come up with your preferred alternative, which aligns with those outcomes and goals of your project. So this changes the planning and design in urban context. It better aligns the considerations of the community, because we're driving the first part of our design process is looking at the local context. And I also think that this is going to help meet the expectations of the local communities, because at the planning level, we're all talking the same language and using those same guidelines. So what we say at the planning level, because there is, years sometimes in between that and the actual project development, and there will be no surprises, or at least minimize those surprises. We'll be using that all the way through the process. And it allows that flexibility in those ranges to meet the local context. And the big thing that I'm excited about as well is that the documentation of the design decisions that are made, we're documenting those all the way through the process. So in the planning phase, we've identified the context, we've identified the performance that we need from that corridor. Then when we're scoping projects, we'll use that same documentation and scope our project, estimate our costs, and then in the design phase, we'll be using that same document, so that there'll be a continuous data flowing through our process. So there was a tremendous effort to get to this blueprint for urban design, and we are going to be rolling the document out next month. There'll be a technical directive that I'll be sending out with the manual of how to implement that, and we'll finish up our training for the rollout training the end of next month as well, and then we'll be setting up the trainings the first part of next year. We'll go out to each of the regions and train our internal staff, and also allow for training our consultant partners as well on how we're going to be using this. Then once it's rolled out, headquarters will be doing a QA and monitoring the use, looking at the documentation now that we have, and we'll be evaluating how consistently we're applying this new methodology in practice and improve that way. So.
Thank you, Steve. So I think a couple key highlights from why we're talking about the urban design or blueprint for urban design is really it's changing from a more rigid process to how we build our roads to a more flexible process. It's trying to think about the modes together and the uses of the system. So in some cases, it may make sense that you have wider lane widths. That's easy for me to say, because you have freight movement through there. In other areas, you may be giving more preference to bicyclists, making wider bike lanes. And then in other areas, you may have a public transportation corridor, and you may have to consider the bus pullouts and other things. So it's really thinking about that multimodal system, allowing that flexibility to really focus on that context. And that's a big change from, I think, where we've had necessarily before.
Right, and those are the trade-offs that we look at. And that's what's in the flexibility. There's ranges now instead of just a fixed standard, so you can, the guidance also gives you some information about, you can go to the high end or the low end of that range based on if this is in place, then you could go to the low range or vice versa. So.
Thank you, Steve.
Yep.
So
So
next,
just
okay,
one comment
please.
on that. I think that's, as I understand it, based on the presentation, that is a perfect example of trying to set a statewide framework that allows for flexibility to local communities. That really is echoing the comments that Commissioner Smith and others have made about regional and local on the ground. Differences are very important to consider and take into effect economically, socially, in terms of transportation use and politically and otherwise. So it's, I think it's a really good piece of work and a nice model for the kind of ways I think we need to be approaching more and more issues. I think about it in the terms of the STS work that we're going to be doing. This is the kind of approach, I think, and the kind of document that really can help us think through how we work with kind of the individuality of different places in the state while still moving a statewide goal forward. And the other thing I thought of was that this can be a useful tool, although it may that this can be a useful piece for the Urban Mobility Office to look at, and while it may, in their work, require some additional or supplemental work, I think it's a very informative piece in terms of how we look at urban mobility in different urban settings, and each setting is different. In Portland Metro, even in Portland Metro, there are, I'll just call them microclimates. So doing a project in Hillsborough or Beaverton is a very different thing than doing a project in inner Northeast. So it's just the kind of, as I'm listening to this, I'm just thinking about this as a way we need to be thinking about for approaching a lot of our work going forward, not just in the planning, but in design, but in terms of kind of a more broader approach to how we setting statewide goals, but then allowing for some flexibility, provided that we're getting to the goals and that we're not watering down the goals. So just a comment. I just want to get a kind of a placeholder in on this because it's exemplative to me of the kind of work we need to be doing in the future.
Yeah.
Commissioner Callery?
I'm curious as to, are there components of the urban plan that would extend to rural communities, rural regions, as far as implementation of, for example, if you're doing a highway project on the Oregon coast, is there a way to then include bike ped components to that? I had the opportunity yesterday to drive all the way up here on the coast, except for the piece coming over here, and I used to ride a bicycle. I wouldn't ride a bicycle on Highway 101 if you paid me $1 million a mile. I mean, it's that frightening to see a truck or a big SUV or something like that, and a guy is just hugging that fog line just to stay on the pavement but out of the traffic lane. And I'm just curious as to whether some of these components can translate into urban execution.
Yeah, yes, they can. You're outside of you're in a rural type of a area, yes. This will translate over to a rural section as well. There's the Minnesota example that I shared. They have done that. They've not just focused on the urban, but they've expanded that performance-based approach to a rural setting, and you would basically do the same thing. What is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve? What are the modes that I need to account for? And then it would, you apply some guidance on making those choices of, okay, if I only have this much width, how do I make, how do I divide that up to allow for the bikes, for example, or whatever your outcome that you're looking for is, so.
And I think the Urban Design Initiative focused on the urban area because of the complexities there first, but I think
Yes.
the intent was always to expand beyond that.
We'll expand it to the rest of the types of facilities that we need to work in.
Mr. Chair, if I could add just one, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Director Strickler and then Commissioner Smith.
This is a bit of an oversimplification. Sometimes I make our chief engineer nervous when I oversimplify an engineering detail, but so please feel free to correct me. But in some ways, our historic practice has been start at a standard and then provide rationale and justification for why you would deviate from that, which is almost a kind of a reduction in what that standard is. What this approach really does is it says start with what your performance goals are and your outcomes that you intend to achieve and build up until you meet those. And then once you meet those, then you're done with your design effort and then you move forward. And so it has applicability that would go across urban and rural. It just simply is, as they described, starts in the urban setting.
Thank you. Obviously, now, rural is on my mind today, so I appreciate the change in the methodology. I think it makes perfect sense. It's not a cookie cutter. It's not, prove to us why you're doing it different than we want you to do it. It's how do we come up with the right solution given the right setting. Having said that, I think I don't want to stop with the urban design. I'd like to see us make progress on developing a rural one. You know, maybe it's an appendix, maybe it's, you know, words matter. So if somebody reads this from Burns, they're going to say, well, that probably doesn't apply to us. So we need to make sure that we're more inclusive.
The AASHTO manual, I referenced the geometric design standards, the green book that we used, it has all of that all encompassing. So when it gets updated, it'll account for all of the rural, and we'll update ours as in accordance with that, so,
And maybe change the name.
yeah.
Thank you very much for the comments and comment from the director and your presentation, Steve. Amanda,
Thank you.
continuing our morning.
All right. So the Oregon Transportation Safety Action Plan was adopted in 2016. This plan is one that's updated fairly regularly because of the federal requirements for it, and it tends to be fairly action-oriented to begin with. A couple highlights from this plan that I think are unique and worth calling out. One of which is the engagement of the Oregon Transportation Safety Committee. Commissioner Brown used to sit on that committee. And they really are lock and step with the Department of Transportation in those emphasis areas that are identified. So each one of those members has decided to chair kind of an emphasis area and make sure that things are getting implemented, really vetting ideas of the department, and really working through that accountability mechanism. So they're highly engaged there. The other one I thought was worth highlighting, and actually the other two that are shown up there, are really the nexus that we have between plans. So I said we have 8 plans, and you may go, why do we have so many plans? That's a lot of plans. Well, there's a lot of specificity and things that we need to figure out within each mode. But there are cross relationships. So this is an illustration of the cross relationship between the bicycle pedestrian plan and the transportation safety action plan. One of the emphasis areas is vulnerable road users. So really, there's a lot of focus right now on education and outreach towards bicyclists and pedestrians and making that safer for them. We've seen pedestrian crashes increase in recent years. The other is, I think, an illustration of just the cooperation within the agency. So in my shop, there's a Safe Routes to School infrastructure program. Within Mr. Costellos' shop, there's the non-infrastructure programs, so the education, the encouragement, the enforcement programs. And so we've really tried to build a comprehensive program across those to achieve the goals not only of the safety action plan, the transportation options plan, and kind of all our statewide goals, and really look at that integration piece. And a couple things I'll highlight from that plan in terms of progress you are, I think, more than familiar with are some of the speed discussions that have come up and come in front of you as well, whether that's through some of the legislation and allowing greater flexibility for some of the jurisdiction partners like we've talked about to have the ability to set speed zones that work appropriately for their area, as well as some draft rules. Another key area is distracted driving, and I think as an agency we've really recognized this as an area that we need to focus. We've formed a task force to start to really look into this and identify ways that we approach. We've been successful in getting some federal funding to really target distracted driving, and then have worked on a number of outreach efforts as well. The last thing I'll highlight from the safety action plan is really localizing those plans. And so the safety action plan is very data driven. So it uses information aggregated at the statewide level to say, okay, where are we seeing the most crashes? What types of characteristics are causing those incidents? And how do we address those? Well, that will vary depending on the community you're at. So the Oregon coast will probably have some different characteristics than we'll have in other parts of the state, or in Eastern Oregon and Burns, for example. They'll have very different characteristics. And so in order to pinpoint and focus their limited safety dollars on the things that's going to matter the most, some localized planning efforts are needed. And we help to financially support those efforts and to provide technical support as well to basically execute the same level of a transportation safety action plan that we have at state at that local level. So we have 7 that have been adopted, and I think we have 6 more that are in progress right now. So I did a briefer update on the safety action plan. And now the transportation options plan, I'll turn most of this presentation over to my program manager here, Stephanie Millar. A couple of remarks I want to say about transportation options, and I appreciate Commissioner Brown's remarks during the statewide strategy too about transportation options and the importance. They tend to be some of the lowest cost strategies that you can do that have a fairly big impact. What do we mean when we say transportation options? It's inclusive of what are traditionally demand management strategies, so vanpooling, carpooling. I think working with employers, that came up during the last discussion too. So when you have a major employer come in, are you working with them on their flexible schedules for their employees? That affects the morning and evening commutes. So there's a number of programs that it entails, but it's also about people's access to different transportation options. So it's the knowledge of those, how to use those safely. So there's a number of components from helping to achieve congestion management, but also equity. We often work with folks that have disabilities, veterans, or others on how to access critical services. So it's really those on-the-ground things that are really important. I think during the public testimony from the Oregon Environmental Council, they mentioned the opportunity for the I-5 Trunnion project, and Ms. Millar is very integrated in that. So we are doing a lot more project applications that Stephanie will talk about a little bit as well. And I think Commissioner Brown, you talked about really working with employers too, and consideration of statewide policies like a trip reduction ordinance and some of those kind of things. So a lot of these things we're considering in here. And as I was flipping through the different plans and preparing this presentation, it struck me in looking at the transportation options plan that we've made progress on a number of these policies, that we've really created this statewide program. We've started to invest with our local partners in it, but we're only at the beginnings right now. With that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie, who's done yeoman's work on creating this program.
Hi. The discussions this morning have really set up nicely for my conversation with you today. How do you advance that? Just that? Okay. So following adoption of the Transportation Options Plan in 2015, we launched a whole new program, kind of wiping away our old program, which had primarily been a grant program, and creating something that had a stronger statewide structure and then continued to use the support at the local levels. The information that we track enables us to keep adjusting and learning as time goes on and make adjustments to the program to have the greatest efficiency. When people participate in the Transportation Options Program and log their trips, we can get some great data that can help us in other areas of interest, such as greenhouse gas reduction. Local providers are really one of the big keys to our success. We have a structure where we do have that support at the state level, but really they're the shoes on the ground that know the local needs and issues and can tailor programs to the local needs and personalities of their communities. They're most often housed in transit agencies, but can come from a variety of places. And they usually work with employers and large trip generators to talk to people about transportation options, promoting carpooling, vanpooling, telecommuting, and transit use. When we spoke to you last year, you had a lot of interest in the innovation grants that we offer. With these funds, we implement the Transportation Options Plan and are able to help us move the needle on our goals. And so we've been able to achieve a lot of really interesting things with that. In addition, we augment the value with those. And every time I give one of the requirements is that they create a case study, a toolkit, or give a presentation to other professionals about the entire process, what they experienced, what their goals were, where they hit hard spots and how they got through them, and what the final outcome was. A really foundational step in launching the new program was to replace the old trip matching tool, which had not kept up with changes in technology. And we found a great tool with a vendor, and it's much more dynamic and user-friendly, and can help you find not only potential carpool matches, but also show you vanpool, transit trips around the entire state integrated between systems, and tell you walking and biking directions as well. You can also log your trips in the system, and when you log your trips is when we get that data that can help us see how we're moving that needle, what the GHG reduction is. In fact, if you take active transportation modes and log those trips, it'll even tell you how many calories you burned. If I actually took the bike commute from my home in Portland to my office in Salem, I could eat 3 cakes. Yeah. In addition to our statewide system, we've created a partnership with the city of Vancouver so that we can bring them into the travel shed and match across the river there. The activities in the gorge are also so strong that we asked them to bring in not just Clark County, but Klickitat and Skamania, because our transportation option provider in the gorge is so skilled and strong at her job. So we're really excited to get to work together on this bi-state issue and deal with these things together. Congestion and construction mitigation. Really, in doing this work at the statewide level, it's helping us put long-standing ODOT policies into practice. One of our first responsibilities with the highway is to protect the existing system and improve efficiency. And transportation options is a great tool for doing that. And with current technologies available for sharing information and doing so much more quickly, the time has really come for transportation options to be elevated in its importance. In addition to the, I'll talk a little bit about the Trunnion project because it's come up this morning. So I have been working with the Region 1 staff and collaborating with the folks on both sides of the river at Metro, TriMet, CTran, and City of Vancouver. And we have planned some exciting integration of transportation options promotion leading up to and during the Trunnion project. So we'll actually start messaging in January about setting up new Vanpools because CTran has a great Vanpool program, and we think that there's a lot of people that we could shift into Vanpools from single occupancy vehicles. One of the projects that we have been working on or just completed working on for construction is one that you're familiar with, the I-105 project in Region 2 in Eugene. I know that came before you several months ago, and I worked with Area Manager Franny Brindle to create an outreach campaign that helped us message about alternatives to driving alone through that very congested corridor. In addition, something unique that we did in this case was to subsidize a bike share station. They have an existing bike share system, and there was no station on the other side of the river, but there's a fantastic bike path system. So for a mere $8,000 investment, we put a bike share station on the Valley River Inn side of the river, adjacent to the park and ride and the bus stop. And we've had fantastic usage of it over the course of the construction period. So we feel like it was a big win. We're continuing to do this work, and I'm continuing to reach out to area managers and talk to them about opportunities to partner and share information and work together, and really looking forward to continuing this work.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think a little bit more on transportation options. So the local providers that we work with, I do want to share, Commissioner Smith, aren't just in the urban areas. They're all over the state. We actually have pretty decent coverage in Eastern Oregon. Our partners, certainly at Commute Options, I'm sure you're familiar with them, are a very strong proponent and have had a very successful program. And I think, again, to emphasize, the boots on the ground are so important because all of our communities are so different. The needs in those communities are really unique, and our transportation options vary greatly. So having somebody there that can really tailor those to the people is very important.
Yes, in fact, our transportation options people in Central and Eastern Oregon are currently working with a tater tot factory in Ontario because they can't get enough bodies to do all the shifts that they would like to employ. And so they're working with people to try and set up carpools and vanpools to help people get to those jobs. Also, I forgot to mention that I gave Jackie some cards so that you can check out, get there, our new carpool matching tool. And if anybody would like a tour of the tool, I'd be happy to give you a lesson.
I think the other thing I want to emphasize too, and Stephanie talks about a couple project applications here though, I think you as a commission and certainly Department of Transportation have talked a lot about congestion in different areas. And we tend to think about very on the ground projects, whether that's an ITS investment or a Rose Corridor or something else to address some of those challenges. Transportation options does offer that opportunity, whether we're working with employers, we're making people aware of those options, and it's often not thought about as a good opportunity for that, but I would challenge us to not lose sight of that as a potential opportunity as we have those conversations on congestion.
Commissioner Simpson.
How far, is there an app for this yet? Okay.
Thank you.
I was just curious because I was just assuming that there's got to be some strong presence of this at our, airports, train stations, things like that, to just, for visitors, to obviously be able to dial into the convenience of getting around in places that they're visiting in the state of Oregon.
Yes, we just launched the new tool in July, and it has a connected app. So you can find transportation options information and log your trips both on that app from your phone if you don't want to use a computer-based system. We have about 5,000 to 6,000 users in the system right now, and really to make this work, it's volume. So we'd love to get more people signed up and participating, and we have had some talks with Oregon 21 for the activities that are going to be going on in Eugene next year, and with the Oregon coast. Unfortunately, this app and system is not great for one-time ride matches, although you can get all of the transit information through the app. Really, the carpool component is for regular trips. Later, we'll be launching a ride board edition, which will allow you to say, I'm going to Seattle this weekend, anybody want to ride with me? But first, we're getting this system up and running fully.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations. I think this last piece is a really critical piece, and I would echo Amanda's comments about its cross-applications and its effect on congestion and other things. The establishment of choices for people to get from first mile to last mile, all of the ways in which people need to move around. We need a critical element of succeeding in all of this is to offer people choice and build out a system that actually gets people from where they are to where they need to be and back effectively, and then encourage them to make responsible choices and think about how they get from A to B. I think if we don't build out a truly multimodal system that is kind of penetrates deep into our communities, taking into account their individuality, and we don't offer people choice other than getting in their car alone and going somewhere, that we're going to have a difficult time meeting challenges we face. So we really got to build out a system that works for people practically and allows them to go do what they need to do and gives them choices. So it's a good day to take the bike or to walk, or you're in a situation where you need to go somewhere and you can do it in a way other than getting in your car every single time. That's progress. So we really need to have a system, and that will look different in every community. We have 200 cities in the state. It'll look different in every city. But I think that's your point about this work as it relates to broader and sometimes more kind of prominent discussions about congestion and management and all of that. It won't just be these big projects, it'll be a whole bunch of smaller projects that help us win in this area. And I think the state, given its traditions, I think is capable of doing that. I think people are interested in looking at things differently and being inventive. And so all of that, I think, will be an interesting part of this journey we're in, the adventure that we're embarking on here. I see Representative McLean in the audience. Great to see you here, so I just want to acknowledge you're here. Commissioner Smith?
Just wanted to take the opportunity, I've had the privilege of working with the commute option folks in Central Oregon for a long time. And the longtime director, Jeff Munson, is retiring after probably over 20 years of service in commute options, and just wanted to give him a shout out.
Thank you. With that, unless there's any other question or comment, I think we'll move to the next presentation, which is on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. So Travis and Lindsay, I think, are our crack team on this small little project, inexpensive project that we're pursuing.
Chair Van Brocklin, members of the committee, for the record, I'm Travis Brower, ODOT's Assistant Director, and I could probably come up with some jokes about the crack team, but I will not do that. I will note that for the moment, Lindsay and I are taking the lead on much of the work of engaging with the legislative committee on the Interstate 5 Bridge Program and doing other work. So that's why we are in front of you today as we're beginning to stand this
well, welcome.
Very important program up. I'm going to walk you through the efforts that we are undergoing today, but I'm going to start with some background about why the heck we are taking on the Interstate 5 bridge once again. Even though some of us have a little bit of PTSD from the last round, we are still recognizing the importance of this issue and recognize the need to go work with stakeholders in the legislature to do something about it. So a couple of just basic background facts about the Interstate Bridge. It's actually two bridges, a northbound span that opened in 1917. For context, it opened before the United States entered World War I, and a southbound span that opened a little bit later in 1958. These two spans cover or carry over 45 million vehicles a year, and it's for the second largest metropolitan area in the Pacific Northwest. It's also a really important trade corridor for the entire West Coast. So it does not just focus on local travel. Over the years, we've had extensive amounts of long-range planning on this section of the freeway. The governor's appointed the I-5 Transportation and Trade Partnership, which created a strategic plan to identify priority improvements between SR 500 in the north and I-84 in the south, or sorry, between I-205 in the north and I-84 in the south. And they identified quite a number of improvements that needed to be made on this vital section of freeway. Most of those to date have been either completed or, in the case of I-5 at the Rose Quarter, have been funded, except for the interstate bridge in the corridor between Columbia Boulevard and SR 500, which we previously referred to as the bridge influence area, and we still refer to some degree. When the I-5 Columbia River Crossing project kicked off back in late 2004, there was a process of identifying the purpose and need for the project on this specific section of the freeway. And there were 6 different areas that you'll hear us talking about regularly. So the first purpose and need area identified was growing travel demand and congestion. As the region's population and economy grows, the traffic over the bridge has continued to grow. Today, each weekday, we see over 138,000 vehicles per day crossing that bridge. That leads to 4 hours of congestion southbound in the morning and 7 hours northbound in the afternoon, evening. So we used to talk about peak hour or peak, rush hour, then it became rush hours. Now it's basically rush hour, rush afternoon and evening on the northbound direction. In the morning, in terms of speed data, the average travel speed is about 15 miles per hour. So we're traveling at under the rate of a normal city street on the interstate at that time of the morning. This also causes significant impaired freight movement, which is a really important aspect of this bridge project. This bridge sits at the critical juncture of all the major freight routes for Oregon and Southwest Washington. That includes the Columbia River Shipping Channel. That includes the 2 ports that are located on either side of the bridge and which are accessed by trucks from the bridge area. And that also includes the transcontinental railroads, the north-south, the Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, the Union Pacific. All of the trucks that need to get to those critical rail yards have to go through this bridge influence area. And so it causes very significant freight mobility issues. This year, the American Transportation Research Institute, which publishes an annual truck bottleneck report, put this as the 29th worst bottleneck for trucks in the entire nation. The worst on I-5, other than I-5 at the Rose Quarter, which was actually listed as the 28th worst bottleneck in the nation. So we've got 2 in the top 30 located within just a few miles of each other. So that obviously creates significant delay for trucks, which for the trucking industry, time is money, and that leads to making our businesses that rely on exports from our farms and forests and factories less competitive on global markets as they deal with traffic here. The bridge is also safe not safe and highly vulnerable to major incidents. So if you've ever driven across this bridge, you recognize how obsolete it is. There's a major hump in it and really should not be safe for traffic over about 35 miles per hour because the sight distance is limited. There's no shoulders for cars when they break down. So if you've ever been across the bridge when a car breaks down, I have just about run right into one because there's no place for them to get out of the way. There are also bridge lifts, which greatly increase the accident rate when the bridge is lifted and all traffic comes to a stop. People come slamming into the back and rear end cars that are stuck because of that bridge lift. And then there's quite a number of closely spaced interchanges, which cause a lot of crashes as well. There's also very limited public transportation. Right now, there's express bus service that operates from Vancouver into Portland and back again. And unfortunately, those buses get stuck in traffic with everybody else. So there's no high-capacity transit mode operating in its own right-of-way that allows people to bypass that congestion. If you've ever walked or ridden a bike across the bridge, you also recognize it's incredibly substandard bicycle and pedestrian facilities. The walkway is about that wide, and so if you are ever walking across it and there's a bike coming, you literally have to hide among the bridge girders in order to let that bike pass. We had a group of legislators out there a couple weeks ago, and literally the entire legislative delegation had to squeeze up against the bridge in order to let a bicycle go by. So it is very substandard, particularly for a region that prides itself on excellent bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And then just to take the cake, this is a bridge, as you can imagine. We didn't know a whole heck of a lot about Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes back in 1917 or even in 1958. So it's not built to modern seismic standards. The bridges are not anchored in sturdy soil. The engineering term I think that I've seen used is incompetent soils. That doesn't mean that they're stupid soils, but they just will not hold that bridge in the event of a major earthquake.
They're just slow learning.
So the reality is that that bridge cannot be retrofitted to modern seismic standards. There's some question whether it could be modified or retrofitted in order to avoid collapse, but it could not be retrofitted in order to really bring it up to that full usability, serviceability standard. We do believe that in a significant earthquake, the bridge would be either rendered inoperable or would likely collapse, which would block the Columbia River shipping channel. So that's an issue. Beyond purpose and need, we should also note that because of the obsolescence of these bridges, it's really, really expensive to keep them in operation. We have a crew of about 5 staff who are there 24/7 to be able to lift the bridge. And it comes with significant cost, about a $1.2 million annual cost just to operate and maintain this bridge. That's not even the capital maintenance cost. We have $280 million in capital maintenance costs over the next 2 decades to keep the bridge in use. You heard during the last presentation about one of those projects, the I-5 northbound bridge, Trunnion, which is some piece of the lift span that helps lift it up, basically an axle in that lift span, has a crack in it. And so we have to replace that as that crack has grown. That could be a 2-week closure of the Interstate bridge, up to 2 weeks. And that will be a little bit of a mess, as you can imagine. I remember the last closure we had to do for the Trunnion on the southbound bridge happened while I was in college. It was a bad enough thing that we actually used as a case study in one of my media classes as to how to address the public in those cases. So we're not exactly looking forward to all of those capital projects that would require significant closures or restrictions on the bridge and significant traffic impacts.
On that last point, on this slide, it would be interesting to compare that to the Glenn Jackson Bridge, just the cost comparison of ongoing costs to the public to keep this relic, in play.
Yeah, Chair Van Broeklen, that's a really good point. I mean, this is a high-cost bridge because of the type of structure. Those steel truss bridges are ones that require frequent repainting. And by frequent, I don't mean every few years, but on a regular cycle. And then just the age of the bridge means it's really hitting that point where we have massive investments ahead of us.
I just think as a talking point, we'll be talking about this all the time for years. So I think we need to start to assemble some comparative information because people know what the Glenn Jackson Bridge is. They go use I-205, and it's the difference between having, and that's not a brand new bridge, but it's a relatively modern bridge, certainly in comparison with this bridge. We need to get some data points that people can understand in this.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Over a period of about the last 20 years, we've had a very lengthy process of working with the public and stakeholders and legislature that led through a significant alternatives analysis process both before the I-5 Columbia River crossing was stood up and then through that project process. We looked at 70 different concepts, different options for not just replacing the bridge, but looking at other alternatives, tunnels, supplemental bridges, arterial bridges, whittled that down to 12 different potential preliminary alternative packages through an in-depth screening process and working with the I-5 Bridge Task Force, or Columbia River Crossing Task Force. That was then whittled down to 5 alternatives that were engaged deeply and analyzed deeply in an environmental impact statement that led to one locally preferred alternative. That locally preferred alternative for the CRC project was a replacement bridge with 3 through lanes, matching the number of through lanes we have today, and then up to 3 add-drop lanes, the auxiliary lanes between interchanges. It also included light rail transit to Clark College, as well as other highway improvements, widening the highway between those interchanges to accommodate the new structure and the new auxiliary lanes, and some of the interchange improvements, as well as a much, much improved bicycle and pedestrian crossing of the river. That alternative was adopted by the CRC task force with a 37-2 vote and then endorsed by project stakeholders on both sides of the river, the state DOTs, City of Vancouver, City of Portland, the transit districts, as well as the metropolitan planning organizations on both sides of the river. So one of the key questions that we had with the CRC was, how do you pay for this project? This is a nearly impossible to read, I recognize now, diagram that we use regularly for a mid-range cost estimate of about $3 billion. And I include this mainly to show that there was a fairly clear breakdown of the costs. On the river crossing, that was about a $1.2 billion cost, and that was going to be covered generally by tolls on users of the bridge. The light rail extension of $850 million was going to be covered by a New Starts grant from the Federal Transit Administration that we worked very hard to ensure that FTA's process was able to accommodate a multimodal mega project like this. And then the roadway improvements on the left in orange, you can see those on the Oregon side. On the right in blue, you can see those on the Washington side, would essentially be covered by contributions from the state. So it was a fairly neat breakdown of a major project cost. All right, so that was looking back. Now let's look forward at what our path forward is on this I-5 bridge replacement program. This is a big week for the project. As you saw, Governor Brown and Governor Inslee got together to sort of officially kick it off and signed a memorandum of intent for the states to cooperate together. We today are bringing forward to you a memorandum of understanding between ODOT and WashDOT that will specify the terms of our engagement together. It's a fairly minimalist document that will be followed by a much more in-depth agency agreement, multiple agreements most likely, between the two states that will get into much greater depth about how we cooperate together. So at the end, I will ask for your approval of that document that was included in your packet. Staff have been assigned to establish the program and meet many of the important milestones that have already been laid out. We'll talk about those in a moment. And we are beginning the process of hiring a program administrator who will be the single individual accountable to both states for moving this project forward, and also bringing in a consultant team. On the last project, we had a large number of folks co-located in an office that included consultant staff, ODOT staff, WashDOT staff, staff from TriMet, and others, all located in a single office together. So we'll be putting that whole team together. And as you, I think, recall, our partners in the Federal Highway Administration could have required Oregon and Washington to repay the $140 million in federal funds that had been expended if we were not able to show some progress forward on the project. They have granted us a repayment extension until September 30th, 2024, earlier in the year, but it was very clear that they needed to see milestones that we were expected to meet in order to give us that extension. We are also beginning a really important process of engaging stakeholders, working with those in the local agencies that are our partners in this project to set forth the vision and values of what we're trying to achieve and how we are going to work together to move this effort forward. As you can imagine, WashDOT and ODOT will serve as the lead partners because we are the ones who are accountable to the public and others for managing this portion of the freeway and delivering this project. But we will have 6 other agencies that serve as program partners. The cities, the transit districts, and the metropolitan planning organizations, all on both sides of the river, all have very important roles to play in this process. So we are beginning that process of developing that shared understanding among the agencies for how to work together on this effort. That will really begin in depth in December. We are in the process of selecting a third-party independent facilitator who will sit down with all these project partners and then bring them together in a room to talk through many of these important issues. We think it's important to bring that third-party independent facilitator in so that any biases the states may have, any agendas, they can really work together across these divides, across the agencies to help us chart that path forward. I'll turn it over to Ms. Baker, who will talk you through also a really important aspect of this, which is the engagement with the legislature.
Good morning, Chairman Bachland, members of the commission. For the record, Lindsay Baker, ODOT Government Relations. So I'll just give you guys a little bit of the highlights in terms of what our legislative engagement has been on this project, knowing that there was a quite robust legislative engagement process in sort of the first iteration of the previous project, right? So you all know that as long ago, I guess, as last calendar year, the Washington legislature was very interested. They received the direction from, the WashDOT received direction from their legislature to move forward with the bridge inventory, which I know you guys have heard about. And then I think as recently as this summer is when the Oregon legislature really started diving in deep. So the presiding officers, Speaker of the House and Senate President, appointed members from each of the chambers bicameral bipartisan to a joint I-5 bridge replacement committee. It is co-chaired by Senator Beyer, who you guys saw yesterday evening, as well as Representative McLean, who is in the audience right now. So they have had 2 meetings to date as that sort of collection of Washington legislators and Oregon legislators. The first one was in late September, maybe? Late October, and then the second one was just last week, I believe, with a third planned for December the 20th. So to date, a lot of what those conversations have really been doing a deeper dive into what Travis just spoke about a second ago. So going through sort of the where we were, how we got there, what the need is, what alternatives were analyzed, what the sort of bridge screening components looked like over time in the previous iteration. And I think now is the time that the legislative committee really looks at their work plan going forward, understanding that the level of comfort in the pace of what that work looks like going forward is a little bit different. Understanding also that the sort of foundational level of knowledge is also different from the Washington side to the Oregon side and also among the Oregon legislators. I'll note that on this list, you'll see Senator Beyer has been in the legislature for quite a while, in the Oregon legislature for quite a while. He was actually part of the first bridge process, the CRC, that first time around, as was Senator Bentz. Representative McClain, I don't think, was on that committee. However, she was very actively engaged in her role on the Metro Council at that time, as was Representative McEwen in the building, but I think that was her first session here. So I really just sort of bring this up to say there's varying degrees of foundational understanding of what the bridge project was the first time around and what we're going to be looking at going forward on this committee. So one place that the agency has really been trying to engage in the work of the committee itself, and even in sort of offline conversations a little bit, has been, what questions do you have? How deep of a dive do you want to go into these different pieces? And how can we, as an agency, be a valuable resource to that conversation? So I'm expecting that going forward, again, the committee will really establish what their work plan looks like. I think it's, like I said, the December meeting, that I expect they'll have a potentially meeting in January. The Joint Legislative Committee will likely have ongoing conversations over the next, obviously, months and years, as we all expect. During the short legislative session in Oregon, I would be a little bit surprised if we had official legislative action, knowing that engagement will be ongoing. So that's kind of all I had to share. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer any about this piece.
Let me talk to you about the next steps and the timeline that we see for this project. So Washington WashDOT, their legislature provided some fairly specific direction about some of the next steps. So that's been incorporated into this plan that we are developing for standing up an overall program office. So as I already mentioned, one of the first key steps is re-engaging key stakeholders in the public, developing that advisory structure to provide input from the regional partners, and also developing a robust and inclusive public engagement plan to ensure that the public's voices are heard and considered and incorporated into this project. We also need to reevaluate that purpose and need. Those 6 points that I mentioned earlier, we need to look back at those to ensure that's still the problem today. I think for the most part, we believe that all of those are still valid issues, but there might be others, and we'll need to re-engage some of the data around that to make sure that we have the most current data about traffic and freight issues and all of that. We need to develop a scope, schedule, and budget for this process, or for this project, especially identifying and analyzing those alternatives that will meet the purpose and need as it's determined. We will need to reevaluate permits depending on the eventual selection of what the final solution is. It may be something that we have permits in place that we can reevaluate versus having to go redo a lot of work. There is still a lot of the work that was done on the original project that is still very valid, especially a lot of the assessments that are based more on the land or the hard infrastructure, as opposed to, say, traffic. We're going to have to do a lot more work on. And then, of course, we need to develop a finance plan. After we've determined what the project looks like, we have to determine the funding sources. We'll have to develop that risk-based cost estimate once the scope is determined, and that will really lead into a conversation about phasing. You may recall that back in 2013, 2014, there was a discussion about whether some elements of the project might be phased over time, because as you can imagine, it may be difficult to assemble multi-billion-dollar funding package all in one fell swoop at one point in time. In terms of the timeline for this project, we have set forth a number of milestone goals. Some of these are based in legislation, but a lot of them are also based in the commitments we made to the Federal Highway Administration on the timeline and process we would use to move the program forward, given the extension that they provided. So WashDOT has a requirement to provide a progress report on December 1st, which is next Sunday. So we're envisioning WashDOT staff sitting around on Thanksgiving, working on that report. The timeline we're looking at in terms of re-engaging the supplemental environmental impact statement will be sometime in the spring, followed by the process that will be really ongoing of engaging key stakeholders in the public, re-evaluating purpose and need, and our key permits. I won't walk you through every one of these timelines, but just note that we would expect that by the summer of 2013, we'd have NEPA complete and could begin the right-of-way phase. That is actually the key milestone for the Federal Highway Administration, summer of 2023. That's the key milestone for the Federal Highway Administration that we gave them as part of that process of receiving an extension. We have to move to the next phase in the process, which is right-of-way purchase, in order to show that progress. And then we would hope to have the construction begin in the summer of 2025. Now, these are targets that we hope to be able to meet, but as you can imagine, a lot can happen between now and there as we work with stakeholders in the public on this process. So we wanted to close by opening the discussion about the Commission's role in this program. You are going to have a lot of very important roles to play, given the accountability of the Department of Transportation on both sides of the river for developing this. We think the Commission will be in a very important set of roles and responsibilities that should help ensure that stakeholders know that their voices can be heard and incorporated into the project, and that gives legislators the confidence that there is an accountability for the department, to the Commission as we move forward with this. So we have laid out, I think, 6 specific areas where you will engage, and there will be others to be determined. So first, as I mentioned earlier, and as we'll come through, is for you to approve the Memorandum of Understanding between the 2 states and any amendments to that. We would have you in the role of generally providing oversight, direction, and strategy for the project, ensuring that we're heading in the right direction as a state agency. You will also help us ensure effective stakeholder engagement throughout this process. We will have ongoing requests for resources for project development. You have already provided $9 million for the project earlier in the year through the redistribution conversation we had in August. That will not be the last time we are in front of you asking for additional resources for this project. Hint, hint, just to set that up for future requests. In addition, it will be very important for you to engage and review and consider that overall construction finance plan, as there are some key Commission roles in that. In particular, under statute, you are the tolling authority for the state of Oregon, both to authorize tolling and set toll rates. As you can imagine, though, that's not something that you can unilaterally do. That is something that you will do in coordination with the Washington State Transportation Commission. So we had a very robust process with them in the last go-round back in 2012, 2013, of working together to develop that toll agreement. And I'm pleased to say that worked very well. The two commissions worked very well together and were able to reach agreement. And that will be a process we will re-engage at the appropriate time. And then, as I note, there are others to be determined, and this will be something of an iterative process as we develop the governance structure, the oversight structure for this project. As you can imagine, there will be roles that will be played by stakeholders, by the legislature, and by the Commission, and we'll be working with you to determine exactly what that looks like over time. So with that, I will stop talking, open to any input on the Commission's expected role, and then before I leave, do not let me walk away before we have asked you for your approval of the Memorandum of Understanding.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Questions? Commissioner Callery.
I was very much involved in the first phase of this project, but I don't recall, was there any right-of-way acquisition during that period?
Not that I want to jump all over
We
Travis'
just happen
presentation.
to have an expert in the room.
We did not have right-of-way acquisition that had taken place at that point, but we did, early on in the process, go through a drilled shaft test and test pile program out in the river to proof some of the incompetent soils, and our design applications for that. And so there was some construction easements, things like that for that process, but there was no right-of-way acquisition.
Could we change that to incapable?
Are we, just hypothetically, are we kind of anticipating the same capital stack allocation as we previously had, or is it going to be, are you assuming it's going to be drastically different?
Commissioner Simpson, that is a really key question. So we had a absolutely beautiful point of alignment between the state funding that the legislature approved in Oregon, between the Federal Transit Administration, and between tolling, all coming together in order to complete that finance plan. Of course, the portion we were missing was the state of Washington. So in that sense, there was sort of a single point of failure. I think what we'd like to avoid in the future is a single point of failure, and that's where developing the finance plan that includes phasing options might allow us to have a slightly different mix of funding. We would certainly hope and expect that we would get back into line for funding from the Federal Transit Administration. But we know that there's some additional work we're going to need to do before that. They have a very rigorous process of assessing transit projects, and then you have to get into a queue, essentially, to get in line for when the funding comes available. So we would probably expect that we would have the same general mix in the sense that the governor's laid out that we should expect tolling to be a component of the finance plan, that there will be state contributions of some level, and that we should look to the Federal Transit Administration for funding. But the exact mix is still a little bit up in the air. We might also seek Federal Highway Administration funding through various discretionary grant programs. That was a component of the finance plan last time that never materialized given the way the federal program structure was put in place. But it has actually changed now, so there are more opportunities for federal highway funding.
Other questions or comments? So if not, the good news is today, all we have to do is approve a memorandum of understanding, but we do have to do that. So that draft is in your materials at section E, so I would take a motion on that.
So move.
Second?
Second?
Discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. There you go. I want to acknowledge again that Representative McLean is here, and I want to thank her for her leadership to date on the renewed Interstate Bridge replacement project, and we look forward to working closely with your committee on that. That's reassuring for me, I think. I don't know about for you. So thank you very much. With that, we have built in a 10-minute break at this point in the meeting, so we'll take our break and be back at 10:45. So we're going to reconvene. I want to reopen the Interstate Bridge topic for a few minutes because I failed to, Mr. Sworn had wanted to make a few comments on that topic and asked to do it, and I had a note here, and I failed to remind myself to call him up here. So I want to give Mr. Sworn 3 minutes. We're going to have to set the clock here, so give us just a second. 3 minutes for comments on the Interstate Bridge. And Marilyn is going to get us organized here. Sorry to spring this on you.
And Mr. Chair, if we can't get that going, I'm happy to keep time for 3 minutes for Mr. Sworn here as well.
Are you okay with that, Mr. Sworn? You need this clock working.
Yeah.
You're okay with
Oh, yeah.
the director doing the timing? All right?
How about I give you a 30-second warning, Mr. Sworn?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm trying to shut.
He will tell you when you
Oh,
can
okay.
start,
Ready?
when his phone is ready to go. So
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. The question I'd like to ask is, do you want new bridges bringing in more revenue to Oregon, or do you want a bridge project that keeps costing people money? It's just a very common fact that when we have bridges in the Portland-Vancouver area, we get lots of shoppers from Washington. And now employees that live in Washington are bringing in $200 million in tax revenue to Oregon. So I believe we need extra bridges, and I'm submitted to you this Washington County study that talks about a northern connector route. I've outlined it in yellow here, and then I included a color copy. And this isn't an interstate highway. It's kind of something like 99 West. And actually, during the hearings on the study, there was a Port of Portland spokesperson who said that extra routes were very vital to the Washington County economy. So there's really quite a bit of support for that, and I know it's popularly supported too. But if we were to rebuild the I-5 bridge, which I don't think is necessary, we're funneling more traffic into down Portland. So then that's another crisis that's going to take money to solve. Not only tolling for the I-5 bridge, but tolling for improving the capacity of I-5. So I see it as kind of a black hole. I hate to use that term, but I see it as really a downward slide into the public paying expenses where we're really not getting that much. So I believe we need a western bridge, and we also need an east side bridge from Highway 14 to I-84 in Troutdale. It's only a 2.5-mile route. The western route, like Washington County is calling the northern connector, we had that reviewed by an ODOT consultant in 2011 at a citizen forum, and he said he liked that idea the best. So I think that the I-5 project, I saw the inception of that. Ed Barnes, a former commissioner in Clark County, very disruptive, very threatening in his
30
testimony.
seconds, Mr. Sworn.
30 seconds. And I would not have tolerated that kind of person. He's the driving force behind this resurrection of the I-5 bridge replacement. And then they've been putting signs out illegally. Identity Clark County has been putting signs in the right-of-way advertising. So, yeah, it's a seismic risk, but we have seismic upgrade technology, and I know ODOT moved towards a concentrated seismic improvement projects in Southwest Oregon where the risk is much greater, and that's substantiated by OSU and USGS research. So we need new bridges that would bring in revenue that stimulate the economies in East Multnomah County and in Beaverton, Washington County. Washington County needs the routes to the ports, as the Port of Portland has stated, and that's what we should be looking at. And a lot of us are dedicated enough to just keep pursuing this issue. So thank you for hearing it.
thank you very much, Mr. Sworn. Again, apologies for not getting you in before the break, but glad you were able to stay. And
It should have been done before the vote was taken,
Yeah.
but I kind of know the vote also.
Is there interest in reconsidering the motion on the MOU in light of Mr. Sworn's testimony? I'd certainly reopen if people want to revisit. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we are now moving into the second half of our morning meeting, and we went from a number of informational discussion pieces other than the MOU. We did not have decision points this morning so far, but now we have a string of them. So we will start with, as I live and breathe, Amanda Peets is going to come back up here. Well, imagine that. So, hello.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be before you again.
Thank you, Amanda. What's your next topic?
So today, we're here to talk to you about setting some criteria that really help with our public and our stakeholder expectations for what we would consider in terms of designating a bicycle route in the state of Oregon. And I'm joined here today by...
Mike Kimlinger, I'm a state traffic roadway engineer with ODOT.
Good morning, I'm Jenna Marmon. I'm the ODOT Region 3 Active Transportation Liaison.
Welcome to all three of you.
Thank you. So Mike's here, not necessarily in a speaking role today, but to help answer questions. So if you have questions on kind of what we consider from an engineering perspective in terms of making a recommendation for a designation, Mike's really the expert on that. And then I have Jenna here who can talk about an existing route so you can get a sense of kind of what those look like in the state of Oregon. So there's really two types of routes in Oregon, a state route, and there's only one of them. It's the Oregon Coast Bike Route that was designated by the commission a few decades ago. And then there are potential future routes known as U.S. bike routes. And really why we're having the conversation today is because there is a lot of continual interest in designating a U.S. bike route, and we really want to help set that criteria, which is the action before you today. You may be familiar with Oregon Scenic Bikeways. Those are not under the purview of the Transportation Commission or Oregon Department of Transportation. Those are managed by the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. So I will turn it over to Ms. Marmon here, who's going to talk about that existing state designation that we have. I'll talk a little bit about potential future designations, and then we'll get into the criteria themselves. I think what will become clear in Jenna's presentation is what is the conditions out there on an existing designated route and some of the good planning work that they've been engaged in.
Thanks, Amanda. So the Oregon Coast Bike Route, it's 380 miles from Astoria down to the California border. It was designated by this commission in the 1980s. The majority is on Highway 101, but there are some deviations onto local streets where it actually goes off, like Seven Devils Road is a good example of a bigger deviation. And it attracts quite the audience, including people from all over the country and all over the world who come to ride it. It's actually the #1 selling adventure cycling map, which is a touring organization. #1 selling out of 110 maps, so it's really quite a popular route. It's a very specific type of rider we're attracting on the Oregon Coast Bike Route, like these folks here. They're willing to carry all that stuff up and down 16,000 feet of elevation gain. So we're doing a planning effort, as Amanda mentioned, and in that effort, we've used this person here, or these kinds of people here, as our design vehicle, as I like to say. So our design vehicle is this person. We're using confident recreational cyclists as our design vehicle. So these are people who are willing to do this, right, on this kind of road. And using that, we've identified about a 4-foot shoulder as our minimum standard. So that's not typically what we would want everywhere, but in this situation, we see that as a good baseline. So that's the rural cross-section, and then in urban areas, we're looking more to a 6-foot bike lane. In our planning effort, we've identified that actually 73% of 101 of the Coast Bike Route currently has that facility. So it's a little bit bigger than you might think. I think the narrow points stick out in our minds, and we're like, wow, look at this. This guy is having to share the travel lane in this situation. But it's actually pretty wide. Maybe not as wide as this really great section down there on the left. But then there's also the more critical needs areas. These are where it's really constrained. And this is what we're really focusing on. So we're looking at these places where it's a short gap and maybe you're riding along and all of a sudden the shoulder drops and you're having to push a button and go through a tunnel, where it's, you know, a little bit scarier, a little bit more unnerving. So we're looking closely at those areas. We're also looking at those longer stretches of places where there are shoulder gaps. And then bridges, of course, are also a concern because a lot of them were built before we had shoulder standards, so they're pretty narrow. But keeping in mind this urban area conundrum, right? So urban areas, we're typically looking at the southbound cyclists because the vast majority of people travel southbound on the route. But in urban areas, we know that people are far more likely to go northbound and southbound. And we also want to make sure that we make those key connections for people to facilitate those short trips, like Chair Van Brocklin mentioned earlier, to facilitate that proper choice, to give them that option. So in the urban areas, we're really looking more closely at the system. And then we're also looking at the short connections between communities and parks. So when there's a very close state park that's a big destination, so a good example is Harris Beach in the South Coast, really close to Brookings, let's up our ante on that facility. Along with these, we're also looking at the Oregon Coast Trail overlap. So you might be familiar with this effort. There's a current effort through state parks and AOC to consider the Oregon Coast Trail. It's very confusing because we have a Coast Bike Route Plan effort and an Oregon Coast Trail effort, but they are two different things, but they do come together in certain areas along the coast, and in those areas, we're looking at how do we best facilitate both of the user groups, both hikers and bikers. So through this planning effort, it's really the first comprehensive consideration of the route since it was designated in the 1980s, and we're really looking to provide that consistency between regions and also identify some of the near-term and incremental solutions that we can implement sooner than later as part of paving projects, for example, but also sort of the longer-term, bigger picture bridge replacements. When we do replace a bridge, let's make sure that we consider that the Oregon Coast Trail and the Oregon Coast Bike Route both use this facility. And that we're also considering the non-infrastructure type things like education and outreach, making sure that the drivers on the coast route know that cyclists are out there, know what, that they are allowed to be on the road, know how to properly pass them, and know that cyclists, and also make sure that cyclists know the rules of the road. So I just want to mention that I actually rode a section of the route a few weeks ago, and I met this woman who was riding, she was following the gray whale cycle. So she had started up in Alaska and was heading all the way down to San Diego. And I just thought, here's a perfect example of our user, right? And I was asking her, well, tell me how the difference is between Oregon and Washington. And she said, oh, it's really great in Oregon. It's really been a good improvement. But there's still these things that we can do better. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Amanda.
Okay. Thanks, Jenna. Appreciate that.
Can I just ask one question? What kind of safety information do we have regarding use of this route?
As far as crash rates? So when we did our analysis of the existing data, there aren't really any big points of crashes other than in the urban areas where you would typically think that they would be. A lot of times it's turning at intersections, bigger intersections. As far as the rural straightaways, we don't have very many crashes at all, and we don't have, bike crashes are typically underreported, so we only hear when there's a big fatal or injury A is what we call them, and we don't have very many. So the volume of users, we actually don't know exactly how many people ride the route. We are working towards getting better data on that. We do know that it's, again, very popular. We do know that segments of it are more popular than others. And we do have some numbers about how many people take trips to the coast annually with a bike-oriented trip. So what we're doing in our agency is trying to collect better data around some of the key points, like at Bullard's Bridge we currently have, which is North Abandon, we currently have a counter. Again, we don't necessarily know how many of those people are using the route as a multi-day rider, but we do know that there's people using that route at least a certain number of trips per day.
Thank you.
Great. So then as we look forward to potential future designations, whether that be state similar to the Oregon Coast Bike Route or a U.S. bike route, I do want to emphasize these are really the interstate connections. So Jenna's example of the woman following the whales is really that trip all the way down between states. So a little bit about U.S. bike routes in particular, because that's what's come up from a stakeholder interest perspective. There was a national network identified that's really a draft network, and there's several routes that traverse through Oregon. However, we do not have any official designations where we've affirmed these draft routes. In particular, there's one called US 76. It's shown up here as kind of the orange line on the map that traverses east to west in the state. That had a lot of stakeholder interest around it about a potential route designation. They were going to launch into a large study, and that really, I think, challenged our organization to start to think about what are our priorities as a state, as well as what kind of information would we need in considering recommendations for a route, and what might that process look like. And we really don't have any of that documented, so I think it's hard for stakeholders to navigate that. So that's why we're having this conversation here today. I think the Oregon Coast Bike Route is one of those locations where we have a little bit more information because of the planning work that's done. Now that's a pretty detailed planning study. We might need higher level information as we talk about the criteria that we go through here. But it has the potential of being a U.S. bike route because it's identified there. And it's also interesting to note that California is going through a process of designating currently their coastal route and having that formalized. I think Jenna talked a little bit about the type of riders that you might expect. Susan Peithman, shown right here, and in the audience, Susan Wave, is, I think, the poster child for somebody that rides a typical U.S. bike route. So it's fairly similar to the riders on the Oregon Coast Bike Route, in that they tend to be very experienced riders, used to riding alongside traffic, going through pinch points at times. And what they're typically considered is the strong and fearless type of riders. That's usually less than 10% of cyclists altogether. So a typical cyclist wouldn't necessarily participate on these types of routes. And they're not really designed for people of all ages and all abilities. And these cute kids might look familiar because they're mine. And so as we start to then think about the criteria in development, I think some of the questions that you've already asked are exactly what come to our mind as we think about designations. First and foremost of which is safety. What is the crash history on the route for motor vehicles and for the cyclists themselves? Thinking about it from an exposure standpoint too. So what is that crash risk in a way, given the volume, the speeds, the conditions of the roads, but also really importantly too, what is the experience that that rider has on it? I think Jenna talked about the type of rider that we're designing it for. We need to think about them as we're designating those routes and what their experience might be on it. The other is the physical attributes, and I think this is really important not only for considering the route, but should a route be designated, we want to make sure this information is very publicly available. It should be people's choice in understanding where there might be pinch points, what conditions they might experience on the route, and providing that information. I think part of the planning effort that Jenna has been engaged in really is helping to identify some of that information and make that known so that people know what to expect. They might pick segments to ride instead as opposed to the whole route. And then lastly, I think the need for the designation is important, and we look at this in a couple of different ways. One of which is why the impetus for it, why now, what's the urgency? There's often a good economic arguments for the local businesses along the route. Cycle tourism brings in a fair amount of money to the state of Oregon. But also, I think from our transportation perspective, what might the changes on the route be in terms of the volume of riders? For example, we may not experience a large change in the volume of riders on the U.S. bike route because we already have that as a very popular route. So if that became also the U.S. bike route, we may not see really much significant volume changes. For other routes that don't have current designations, potentially there could be increases in the volume of riders. So this is by far the quickest presentation of today. And really, we're at a point where we're seeking your approval of the criteria that are listed here, the 4 that we've gone over today, and that are included in the packet. We have a handout that we then make available to the public and stakeholders like the Adventure Cycling Association that really promote these routes, in really knowing what your expectations are as you consider these types of facilities. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions.
If I might add one thing. I forgot to mention that the honest truth about this project is that we've kind of been dreading actually riding it for the aforementioned reasons that you brought up earlier, Commissioner Callery. And I rode this, you know, a pretty good segment of it a few weeks ago, like I mentioned, and I totally get it. I totally get it. It's beautiful, it's stunning, and it's nowhere near as uncomfortable as it feels for drivers as it is to ride it. So when you're riding the route, it feels, and I think as we look at these, that's something to keep in mind, that we all have a pretty strong automobile focus, because that's how we view most of our travel is by automobile. And as you're out there actually doing the riding, it is pretty amazing. And it's not anywhere near as unnerving as it might feel.
When I drove up yesterday, I was focused on a couple of riders I saw. And that section immediately north of Florence, where it's curvy and those are tight curves, and there's almost no shoulder at all. I got to thinking about that, and I thought, man, you have to be fearless to do that. So that was my thought process.
So are there other questions or comments? I'd entertain a motion if the members of the commission are ready to approve these criteria.
I move to approve the designation of bicycle routes within the Oregon Transportation Commission and the Oregon Department of Transportation's authority.
I'll second.
Second? Okay. Discussion, comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Approved. Thank you very much. Amanda, have a nice weekend. We're going to find something for her. We're going to get her back up here. Let's move on to our next item, also a decision item, and Hal and Karen are here to talk to us about that. And before you begin your presentation, I also want to just note that Commissioner Brown has been very actively involved in this particular topic. So look to her for her insights on this. Thank you.
Is it just not working? Yeah, sorry. Sorry, well, that's better. The Special Transportation Fund is focused to provide transit opportunities for folks with disabilities and the elderly. And the newly created Special Transportation Improvement Fund is really about increasing public transportation opportunities. We were also directed to return to the 2020 legislature with a report on the status and plans for consolidating the programs and on the number of FTE and costs of administering the new consolidated program. Since the conclusion of the 2019 legislature, ODOT, and specifically my division, we created and consulted with an advisory committee that has helped develop the recommendations for changes that are required to merge the two programs, develop concepts that were really required to inform the statutory changes in order to be able to lead to a successful consultation. We pretty comprehensively analyzed the consolidated program management and the required staffing to appropriately administer it. And really, our emphasis in doing that review was around how do we reduce redundancies and how do we increase efficiencies. We also, just to make sure that we were as open and transparent as possible, we developed a consolidation website that was providing basically real-time updates to the process we went through. We prepared a draft plan and a schedule for the program consolidation, assuming legislative action in 2020. And the goal is really to achieve full consolidation of the two programs by the 21-23 biennium. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Criswell to really walk you through the details.
Good morning, Commissioners. Director Strickler. Karen Criswell, ODOT Rail and Transit Division. So as Hal mentioned, we appointed a 17-member advisory committee, and thank you to Commissioner Brown for her excellent leadership as part of that committee. The membership of the committee represented a diverse array of interests, including all types of public transportation providers from across the state, urban and rural providers, as well as advocates for various transit-dependent groups, such as for older adults, people with disabilities, equity and environmental justice, and social and human services agencies. The advisory committee met 5 times over the course of 2 months, which I hope to never do ever again with an advisory committee. This is one of the hardest working advisory committees I have experienced. They had a lot to do in a very short period of time with some very technical information, and they were phenomenal. The committee was charged with developing concepts that maintained the intent of both programs, such as including the areas of emphasis for each of the funding programs. As Hal mentioned, STF focused on older adults and people with disabilities. STIF is for public transportation, but it also has a legislative focus on serving low-income households, low and no emission vehicles, improving connectivity of the statewide system, among other emphases. They were also charged with reconciling differences between the two programs. We really asked the committee, and part of their charge was trying to stay at a level, and I think former Commissioner Abaney said it best when she said what we're really looking for is how do we braid these two programs together and keep moving and keep on the schedule that the legislature has asked us to deliver on.
Karen, you're not going to hear any hair analogies from me. There's going to be a difference between me and Tammy for reasons that are very apparent.
Fair. The committee developed their own success criteria, and they focused that they then used to evaluate the concepts that were developed by both ODOT and the committee. They looked for things such as, will it enable efficient administration of the consolidated program? Does it maintain funding flexibility that each of the programs have? And they honed in on prioritizing services for older adults, people with disabilities, and low-income households as an area that they wanted to make sure those areas were kept whole. And to the extent possible, minimizing any negative impacts on existing systems. And then also maintaining or improving the flexibility in the types of services that could be provided, because there are some differences in eligibility between the two programs. The committee's recommendations really landed in 4 main areas. The first was on local processes. Both programs have local advisory committee process requirements. Recipient eligibility was the second area. Again, differences between programs. Funding allocation. The committee opted to put forward 2 different funding allocation options, which have many similar characteristics, but some distinct differences that will provide a policy choice to the legislature, and I'll get to that momentarily. And then they also made a recommendation around ODOT's administration and program management approach, or not approach, but funding for us to do that. So first, the local process requirement. So where the committee landed with that is that local agencies must have a minimum of at least 1 advisory committee, but they could have more advisory committees or subcommittees if they chose to do that. The reason for this is to give flexibility statewide, so some areas that wish to continue to have their older adults and persons with disabilities committee could do that to get that very specialized expertise. The rural areas, on the other hand, often have a really hard time finding enough folks to volunteer on a single committee, let alone 2. So this proposal would continue to do that. It also includes some recommendations around some of the specific activities that could be within the committee's purview. And this is carrying forward some language from existing statute. Recipient and project eligibility. This would give lead agencies the option of allowing private, for-profit, nonprofit providers to be recipients or sub-recipients of funds under specific circumstances. The reason for this is that there are some differences between STF and STIF that this sort of meets in the middle. And part of how it does that is under STF, nonprofits, private for-profits are eligible to apply for funds through a direct recipient. It has been our understanding that they do not have that ability to do that under STIF, but could receive the funds as a contractor. So this would be slightly more open than STIF currently is, but slightly more restrictive than STF currently is. The funding allocation options. So there's a lot of similarities between the 2 funding allocation options. The issue that we were trying to solve here, or the problem, is that STF allocates, has formula and discretionary, as does STIF, but the percentages are different. So the committee landed on, and you might recall that the 2019 legislature directed us to use STIF to replace what had been about 10.1 million of general funds for STF. So this approach would use STIF to backfill STF formula, then allocate the remaining STIF funds, 90% by formula, 5% to a discretionary competitive fund, 4% for competitive discretionary for intercommunity services, and 1% to ODOT for the Technical Resource Center. As you might recall, right now, the 1% for the Technical Resource Center, we're also expected to use that for our program administration. Both allocations, so under this scenario, it would just go to ODOT for the Tech Resource Center. Our administration, program management administration, would be taken off the top, and I'll speak to that concept next. It's a separate concept. It would also maintain the minimum base formula allocations for those currently 16 providers that are either in really low population areas or low payroll areas, and that helps to ensure that across Oregon, the smallest, lowest wage earning areas still have some level of funding that they can provide some public transportation options. It would also add a new STIF criteria, which is to provide service for older adults and people with disabilities, which should give STIF agencies a greater sense of flexibility in how they allocate those funds. So where the 2 allocations are different and the policy choice. Concept A is the most similar to our existing 2 separate programs in that STIF would continuously backfill what had been the STF funds. You might recall there's the so-called legacy funds, which includes a portion of the non-highway gas tax, excess ID card revenues, and my brain just went blank.
Cigarette tax.
Cigarette tax, thank you. So if those revenue sources decline in the future, STIF would backfill that as well, starting with the 1921 funding level rate. And then the STF formula portion of the consolidated fund would be allocated by population, as it currently is, and the rest by that formula I described earlier. Under Concept B, what Concept B does that's fundamentally different is it does a certain level of backfilling of STF, but only the general fund portion. Any changes in the legacy revenues, it would not backfill for that. And the backfill above the legacy revenues would be distributed by payroll. So what that means is areas, it's a net zero statewide, but some areas there are winners and there are losers. So areas that are suburban or rural areas that tend to send a lot of commuters to work in urban areas, those suburban areas would receive less revenue under Concept B, and the urban areas would tend to receive more revenue. So probably the clearest example of this is where TriMet would see a 7% increase in their STIF formula portion, or STF formula portion, and Columbia County would see a 15% decrease in the 21-23 biennium under this method. So you could see that that does present a policy choice for the legislature, and the committee did vote unanimously to put both of these forward. ODOT administration. So we decided up front to be very transparent about the need to address our program administration rate and management costs in order to reconcile differences between STF and STIF. STF currently allows us to take those costs off the top. STIF limits us by statute to 1%. What this has created is a situation where we are out of compliance with our federally approved indirect administration rate, which requires us to equitably allocate our administrative costs across all of our revenue sources. So our FTA revenue sources and our STF revenue sources, we currently allocate about 10% to those programs. And for STIF, we're limited to 1%, which means we're not fulfilling our technical resource center obligations as well as we could have. And our other programs are also paying for a pretty not insignificant portion of our STIF administrative costs. We have been using our STF admin funds in addition to our direct administrative costs for projects of statewide significance that benefit all transit providers, such as paying for the third-party compliance reviews that we conduct. And we also use it to fill gaps in the statewide transit network as match, for example, for a few of our intercity services, where we provide service where no local provider is able to or is willing to do it. The CAC on this one recommended with a majority vote that ODOT be allowed to take audited program administration and management costs off the top, and that our eligible expenditures include projects of statewide significance that support the transit network, as well as managing the operation of transit services that fill the gaps. So essentially, as we have been able to continue to provide the service and do as we have done with STF, I think it's worth noting that with this approach, we are not asking for $1 more than we are already receiving. We currently put out approximately 96% of the revenues that come through our shop. The funding goes to local transit providers for on-the-ground services across the state. And our program admin and management, including projects of statewide significance costs, are coming in around 4% right now. One of the things that we shared with the committee that I think they found somewhat compelling
is that we are the only agency that's in a unique position to keep an eye out for the statewide transit network and the connections between communities and how people really get around. With the addition of STIF, providers now have more funding and so much more that they're able to do in terms of making those connections. So part of our job is analyzing the network and identifying those gaps and working with providers to fill those gaps. So the last piece of this, we took a close look at our program management administrative costs and looked at where would a consolidation save money. And part of what's important to understand about how we operate is that we have 12 different funding sources right now. And our staff aren't siloed working on just a single program. They work across programs. So for example, the support analysts that make grant payments and review that information, they have a geographic area that they focus on, but they handle all fund sources. Our capital program coordinator, who's also our STF program coordinator, also manages our transit asset plan. She manages the price agreements for all of the funds. So when you look at, is consolidation gonna be more efficient? In some ways, yes, but it becomes a small percentage of most of our staff's time, not we don't need this person or that person anymore to administer the program. So with our existing 25 FTE and our the CIC's recommended admin rate, we think that that is a sufficient funding level and sufficient staffing to manage a consolidated program. I should mention that that the CAC, while it had a majority support for our administration, there were a handful of folks that didn't support it. And it tended to be the larger transit districts, not all of them, who tend to rely on us less for program support and for technical assistance as compared to our rural and smaller providers. And there were also some concerns as to whether it was within the committee's purview to put forward a recommendation on our administration. We thought it was important for the committee to do so because that makes a big difference, or it makes a difference when it comes to allocations. We had a few other considerations that we put forward that were things that the committee did not consider, but there's a few other differences, smaller probably considerations and points of clarification around whether and some of it was simply pointing out to the legislature. You have one program that prohibits supplanting of state funds with local funds. You have another one, STIF, that emphasizes and has legislative intent around that, but not an overt statement. So is that something you want to take up, legislature? Some clarification that the consolidated funds could be used to either improve or maintain services, and that recognizes that STF has been maintaining services for a long time. And STIF will soon be doing that as well once these first round of improvements are made. And then allowing client-only projects to be eligible for funding to be submitted as is currently allowed under STF.
So to wrap this up a little bit, next steps. So with the receipt of endorsement of this plan by the OTC, our intent is to transmit it to the 2020 legislature and have them take this up from a statutory perspective. If they do complete that work this session, we would immediately move towards rulemaking this spring to really come up with the processes to administer the new programs as we see them. And just kind of really to summarize this, I would be remiss if I did not give a large shout out to the team that worked on this effort. I have amazing staff, and they did a tremendous amount of work in a very compressed amount of time while they still kept their regular business going. And so I've got to give them a shout out. I have to do the same thing for our advisory committee. We pulled together folks, we worked them hard for 5 weeks. They were focused, they were thoughtful, They really took a statewide consideration in view, or, you know, in terms of their consideration as opposed to their own particular single interests. And I think it's just a credit to the type of folks that we routinely engage in. Just in final review of the plan we're putting forward, we had a strong majority from that CAC on all of the positions that we are advancing. We think they're reasonable, we think they're feasible, and we think that they establish a very, very solid framework in order to be able to blend these two programs and to make sure that the state's investment in public transportation is on a sound financial footing moving forward. And so with that, I would ask for a commission endorsement of this plan.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And as I understand it, you're asking for an endorsement, not an approval. It's going forward to the legislature. Questions of Hal or Karen? Commissioner Brown, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, I'll always add comment to this. I think Hal actually said it already, but I really appreciate not only the staff that worked on this, the facilitator, the advisory committee. I think our first meeting was spent just making sure that people took the position that we were looking at this at a statewide situation and not their own personal transit agency or area. And I was really proud of them because they were able to turn it around. It was kind of doubtful the first probably 2 hours, and we were pretty much sweating through the situation, but they came around. And I think that this plan gives the option for the legislators to actually make a decision on which direction they want to go in funding this, and how it really, the supporting documentation in it really shows that there was a lot of thought in the process, and I think it's a solid plan.
Would you like to do the honors on the motion?
Absolutely. I'd like to make a motion to endorse the draft Special Transportation Fund, Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, Consolidation Report, and Plan for the Oregon Department of Transportation Rail and Public Transit Division.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion on the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion approved. Thank you for your good work. Thank you, Commissioner Brown, for your leadership and that of the advisory committee, as well as the department. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And
Okay.
before Hal leaves, I think this is your last official
Is this it?
day.
It actually is. It
And
actually
so I
is.
want to thank you.
It's been a ride. I have said for well over 25 years that there hasn't been a single day coming to ODOT that I haven't gotten up and looked forward to coming to work. That doesn't say it was easy, but I've looked forward to coming to work every day. It's an amazing agency. It's in good hands. It's time to pass the baton to somebody with a little more energy and a little more smarts than I have. So thank you.
Well, congratulations on your career, Hal. You've been instrumental in the areas you worked in and a real leader in the organization. And with you and Bonnie both leaving at the same time, it's a big change. Is there anybody else out there that we need to know about? No, I'm just. Thank you both very much, and thank you for all of your good service. Director Strickler, anything to add?
I was lucky enough to be able to get my comments in this morning in the Director's Corner, but I just want to say thank you to Hal as well. Hal and I have had the opportunity to work together for quite some time, off and on, in different capacities. I've affectionately called him the fixer. A lot of times he goes into situations that seem sticky, and he has the opportunity to kind of work within those situations and really help out. So I've appreciated that aspect of Hal's service, as well as just knowing him personally.
Thank you very much. We'll move to the next item. Kat Silva is here, talking to us about the conditional fuels tax increase accountability report, which is, I hear, hot reading out in the general market.
Good morning, Chair Van Brothen, Commissioners, and Director Strickler. As you mentioned, I'm here today, for the record, my name is Kat Silva. I am ODOT's House Bill 2017 Implementation Project Manager. And as you mentioned, I am here today to both present to you the final draft and also seeking your approval of this final draft of the Motor Fuels Tax Increase Accountability Report. And recall that there are several components within House Bill 2017 related to transparency and accountability, and this is probably, in my view, and most, I would say, the most critical of those components, given that it is tied to the anticipated fuels tax increase on January 1 of 2020, and then future submissions will be tied to future increases as well. And so the draft you have in front of you addresses several components within Section 45 of House Bill 2017. What we did is we kind of broke apart that section, looked at all the various conditions and reporting requirements, and tried to group them together in a way that made this the best read possible. And given our requirements, we did our best, and hopefully our best was a good read for you all and will be a good read for the legislature. For me, the biggest takeaway is that we did meet all of the conditions, and we have provided all of the required status reports within this larger report, and we anticipate getting that fuels tax increase, which is a huge first step in meeting our accountability requirements and establishing greater credibility within the legislature. So with that, I would welcome your questions, concerns, comments, anything that you have for me.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the report. I think it's very well put together, and obviously these gates we're going through of accountability and transparency and completion of work that then lead to the next increment of funding are critical. One thing I think we can all agree on is that what's in front of us is going to require all the resources in House Bill 2017 and significant additional resources through tolling and other means. So thank you for the work, and thank the department for all of its efforts to meet these deadlines and complete all of these elements to get us to this point today. So with that, I turn it over to others on the commission for questions or comments. Commissioner Smith?
I move to approve the 2019 Conditional Motor Fuels Tax Increase Report and direct staff to submit the report to the Joint Committee on Transportation by December 1st, 2019.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion on the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was easy.
Okay, let's move to the next item. And I think Cooper is joining us, yes. This is another approval, this one related to the CIAC. Cooper?
That's correct, Chair. Good morning. I think most of you know me, but for the record, my name is Cooper Brown. I'm the Chief of Staff for the OTC. So another scintillating read. I don't think it'll make the New York Times bestseller list, but it is a report that you all owe to the legislature. And specifically, it's the progress report on the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee. So just to give you a little bit of background, refresh your memory, as you'll recall, House Bill 17 directed the commission to establish an advisory committee to help the department look at three things. One is increasing and maintaining efficiency across the department. The other is managing and developing key performance measures. And then the third is to review and recommend actions in regard to projects costing more than $50 million. In 2018, in March of that year, you all established the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee. Many of you have served on that body or serve on it currently. And in addition to the House bill that established the requirement for this body, they also required you as the OTC to submit every 2 years a report to the legislature on the progress of this committee. More specifically, what has the committee recommended to ODOT and how has ODOT responded to those recommendations? So the report before you is an explanation of all of those recommendations that have occurred since 2018 and those responses from ODOT. It is broken into the 4 main sections that the CIAC has established to be the areas where they're going to focus. And those include project delivery, audits, general efficiency, and performance management. In addition to that, we've also included a section in there that speaks a little bit to the other issues and outside agencies and actors that affect ODOT's overall performance, because of course the department doesn't operate in a vacuum. I think you've had a few weeks to review the report now. The final thing I would add is that this report and the language in it has been reviewed and approved by the CIAC members themselves. And the hope is that you, like you did with the last report, that you will review it and approve it for our submission to the legislature in order to meet the timeline of December 1st.
Questions from the commission on the report? Do I have a motion?
Well, as the newest member of the CIAC, at your request, I'm pleased to.
I know, I'm not going to live that down soon.
No, I'm pleased to be involved in it. So I move to approve the 2019 Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee Progress Report and direct staff to submit the report to the Joint Committee on Transportation by December 1st, 2019.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those, is there discussion on the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion approved. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Okay, let's move to the next item. This is also Cooper's item, and this involves delegation of authority to the new director.
I'm no Amanda today, but I do get a twofer apparently. So, so yes, the next
Would
item.
Amanda like to get, no.
She left. So this item before you is really the culmination of the commission's work over the last few years, or few months rather, excuse me. So just, if I will, I'll walk you back through the timeline that got us here in preparation for your decision. As you'll recall, earlier this year, Matt Garrett announced his retirement from being the ODOT director after a long and illustrious career. And then a couple of timeline points for you. In July 1st, or on July 1st, the commission appointed Paul Mather to be the deputy director of the department to fill in that leadership role upon Matt Garrett's departure. You also delegated certain authorities to Mr. Mather. And then on September 10th, you took action to hire Mr. Strickler to be the next ODOT director, pending the successful execution of a number of qualifying actions, one of which is Senate confirmation, which occurred earlier this week. And you also appointed Chris to fill in as the deputy director on October 7th of this year, and take the reins really from Mr. Mather, and take all of those authorities that previously resided with Paul and take those upon himself. We anticipate that next Monday, the 25th, the Senate will submit its formal recognition letter to the governor, affirming Chris's confirmation, which is really the final qualifying action that we've been waiting for, and allows you all to carry out the action before you today. The other point I would note for you is that state rule requires the ODOT director to furnish a fidelity bond of not less than $200,000. So with those facts before you and the history kind of laid out, I would welcome your motion.
Unless there are questions, I think this is pretty straightforward. I look for a motion on the delegation of authorities to the new director.
Chair, I move to approve the delegation order before us, which will restore all of the director's authority consistent with Delegation Policy 5 adopted by the Commission on March 15th, 2018, and require Director Strickler to furnish a fidelity bond of not less than $200,000.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. I want to say here that this photograph that is up here, Chris, I want to see that kind of steely-eyed leadership and an ability to use those very tenacious horns as necessary. Good luck in your new role. Okay, consent agenda. And I think I have several recusals that I've submitted to you, so I don't know what portion of this I get to vote on. So please explain us, take us along the way.
Mr. Chair, happy to do that. Thank you for your previous action, by the way, I think. So I understand that you may have potential conflicts on our consent agenda, specific to consent calendar item number 3. Is that correct?
That's correct, and as I previously informed you, Mr. Director, there are several potential conflicts of interest I have on various of those issues before us, and so I'm seeking recusal on those, and will not participate in an abundance of caution that there may be a potential conflict. So I have already submitted those for the record.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given these potentials, can we pull forward consent item 3 and ask for a motion on that consent calendar item?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
With the recusal, I am just going to let the other members of the commission vote on this. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Approved.
Okay. At this point, Mr. Chair, I'd ask for a motion on the rest of the consent calendar in block, those being consent items 1, 2, and then items 4 through 7.
Is there such a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Approved. Is there any other business before the commission today? If not, we are adjourned. Have a great Thanksgiving, everyone.